Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, translated by David Magarshack. Part 1. On a very hot evening at the beginning of July, a young man left his little room at the top of a house in Carpenter Lane, walked out into the street, and as though unable to make up his mind, walked slowly in the direction of Kokushkin Bridge. He was lucky to avoid a meeting with his landlady on the stairs. His little room under the very roof of a tall 5-story building was more like a cupboard than a living room. His landlady, who also provided him with meals and looked after him, lived in a flat on the floor below. Every time he went out he had to walk past her kitchen, the door of which was practically always open, and every time he walked past that door the young man experienced a sickening sensation of terror, which made him feel ashamed and pull a wry face. He was up to the neck in debt to his landlady, and was afraid of meeting her. It was not as though he were a coward by nature, or easily intimidated. Quite the contrary. But for some time past he had been in an irritable and overstrung state, which was like hypochondria. He had been so absorbed in himself, and had led so cloistered a life, that he was afraid of meeting anybody, let alone his landlady. He was crushed by poverty, but even in his straitened circumstances had ceased to worry him lately. He had lost all interest in matters that required his most immediate attention, and he did not want to bother about them. As a matter of fact, he was not in the least afraid of his landlady, whatever plots she may be hatching against him. But rather than be forced to stop on the stairs and listen to all the dreary nonsense which did not concern him at all, to all those insistent demands for payment, to all those threats and complaints, and to have to think up some plausible excuse and tell lies, no, 1,000 times better to slip downstairs as quietly as a mouse and escape without being seen by anybody. This time, however, as he reached the street, his fear of meeting his landlady surprised even himself. Good Lord, he thought to himself with a strange smile, here I am thinking of doing such a thing, and at the same time I'm in a jitter over such a trivial matter. Well, of course, everything is in a man's own hands, and if he lets everything slip through his fingers, it is through sheer cowardice. That's an axiom. I wonder, though, what people fear most. It seems to me that what they are afraid of most is taking a new step or uttering a new word. However, I'm talking too much. It's because I talk too much that I do nothing. Still, I dare say the opposite is probably true, too. I talk too much because I do nothing. It's during this last month that I have got into the habit of talking to myself, lying about all day long in that beastly hole and thinking all sorts of absurd things. What the hell am I going there for now? Am I really capable of doing that? Is that serious? Not a bit of it. It isn't serious at all, just amusing myself by indulging in fantastic dreams. Toys, yes, I suppose that's what it is, toys. It was terribly hot in the street, and the stifling air, the crowds of people, the heaps of mortar everywhere, the scaffolding and the bricks, the dust, and that peculiar summer stench which is so familiar to everyone who lives in Petersburg and cannot afford to rent a cottage in the country. All that had a most unfortunate effect on the young man's already overwrought nerves. And the unendurable stench from the pubs, which are particularly numerous in that part of town, and the drunks he came across every few yards, although it was a weekday, provided the finishing touch to a picture already sufficiently dismal and horrible. For a brief moment an expression of the profoundest disgust passed over the young man's refined face. He was, incidentally, quite extraordinarily handsome young man, with beautiful dark eyes, dark brown hair, over medium height, slim and well built. But soon he sank into a sort of deep reverie, or perhaps he might even more truly be said to have fallen into a kind of coma, and he went on his way without paying any attention to his surroundings, and without even giving them a thought. From time to time he would mutter something to himself, because of his habit of indulging soliloquies, a habit to which he had just acknowledged himself to be addicted. At that moment he was fully aware that his thoughts were at times confused, and that he was very weak. For 2 days now he had hardly anything to eat. He was so badly dressed that any other man in his place, even if he were accustomed to it, would have been ashamed to go out in the daytime into the streets in such rags. It was true, though, that in that particular part of town it would be hard to astonish anyone by the kind of clothes one wore. The proximity of the Haymarket, the great number of disorderly houses, and most of all the working-class population which crammed these streets and alleyways, and the centre of Petersburg, lent so bizarre an aspect to the whole place that it would indeed have been strange to be surprised at meeting any man, however curiously dressed. But so much bitter contempt had accumulated in the young man's heart, that notwithstanding his occasional youthful fastidiousness in dress, he was least of all ashamed of his rags in the street. He would no doubt have felt differently if he had met some of his acquaintances or former friends, whom as a rule he was not very fond of meeting. And yet, when a drunken man, who for some unknown reason was being taken somewhere in a huge empty cart, drawn by an enormous dray horse, suddenly shouted at him as he drove past, "Hey, you there, German hatter!" and began bawling at the top of his voice and pointing at him, the young man at once stopped in his tracks and clutched nervously at his hat. His hat was tall and round, and it had come originally from Zimmermann's fashionable shop, but it was very shabby now, grown rusty with age, full of holes, and covered with stains, without a brim and cocked on one side at a most disreputable angle. But it was not shame, it was quite another feeling, a feeling that was more like fear, that had overtaken him. "I knew it," he muttered in confusion. "I thought so. That's the worst of it. It is just such an idiotic thing, such a trivial detail that could ruin the whole plan. Yes, I'm afraid my hat is too noticeable. It's incongruous, and that's why it's noticeable. With my rags I ought to wear a cap, any old cap, not this horror. Nobody wears such a hat. It can be seen a mile off. And people might remember it. Yes, that's the trouble. They might remember it, and there's your clue. In this sort of business one has to attract as little attention as possible. It's the small things that matter, the small things. It's just the small things that ruin everything, always ruin everything." He had not far to go. He even knew how many steps there were from the gate of his house. Exactly 730. He had counted them one day when he was carried away by his dreams. At the time he had put no great trust in those dreams of his. He merely excited himself by their hideous but fascinating audacity. But now, a month later, he began to regard them in a different light, and in spite of those bitter monologues about his own impotence and indecision, he had unconsciously got accustomed to looking on his hideous dreams as a practical proposition, though he still did not believe that he would ever carry it out. He was even now going for a rehearsal of his plan, and with every step he took, his excitement grew stronger and stronger. With a sinking heart and trembling nervously, he approached an enormous house, which on one side looked on to the Yekaterinski Canal, and on the other on to Sadovaya Street. This house was divided up into small flats, and inhabited by all sorts of tradespeople: tailors, locksmiths, cooks, Germans of every description, girls earning a living in all sorts of ways, low-grade civil servants, and so on. People entering or leaving the house seemed to be darting to and fro under its two gates and across its two courtyards. 3 or 4 caretakers were employed here. The young man was very pleased not to meet any of them, and he at once slipped, without being seen, through the gates and up the flight of stairs to the right. The stairs were dark and narrow. It was the back entrance, but he knew all that already, having made a careful study of it before, and the whole situation appealed to him. In such darkness even a pair of prying eyes were not dangerous. "If I'm so frightened now," the thought crossed his mind involuntarily, as he mounted to the 4th floor, "what would it be like if I were really going to do it?" On reaching the 3rd floor, he found his way barred by some furniture removers, who were removing the furniture from one of the flats. He knew that a German civil servant and his family had lived in that flat. "The German is moving out," he thought, "which means, of course, that on the 4th floor, on this staircase, only the old woman's flat would be occupied for some time. That's fine, just in case," he said to himself again as he rang the bell of the old woman's flat. The bell rang very faintly, as though it were made of tin and not of copper. The small flats in such houses all have bells that ring like that. He had forgotten what the sound of that bell was like, and now the peculiar tinkling noise brought something back to his mind, and he saw it all very clearly. He gave a start, so weak had his nerves grown by now. A moment later the door was opened cautiously about an inch. The woman occupier of the flat examined her visitor through the narrow opening of the door with evident distrust, and all he could see was her little eyes glittering in the darkness. But noticing that there were a lot of people on the landing, she took courage and opened the door wide. The young man stepped into the dark hall, divided by a partition behind which was a tiny kitchen. The old woman stood silently before him, and looked at him inquiringly. She was a very small, wizened old woman of about 60, with sharp, malevolent eyes, and a small, sharp nose, and a bare head. Her unattractive, colorless hair, which was only just streaked with gray, was smothered in oil. Some sort of flannel rag was wound about her long, thin neck, which looked like a hen's leg, and in spite of the heat an old tattered fur-lined jacket, yellow with age, was thrown loosely over her shoulders. The wizened old woman was coughing and groaning all the time. The young man must have given her rather a peculiar look, for a gleam of her former mistrust instantly reappeared in her eyes. "Raskolnikov, a student. I was here a month ago," the young man murmured hastily with a slight bow, remembering that he had to be as civil as possible. "I know, sir. I know very well you've been here before, the old woman said, enunciating every word very clearly, but still keeping her questioning eyes fixed on his face. Well, so I've come back again on the same business, Raskolnikov went on, feeling a little put out and also surprised at the old woman's mistrust. I suppose she's always like that, he thought, unable to suppress an unpleasant feeling. I just didn't notice it before, that's all. The old woman made no reply, as though hesitating. Then pointing to the inner door, she drew back to let her visitor pass. "Won't you come in, sir?" she said. The small room, which the young man entered, had yellow wallpaper, geraniums and muslin curtains at the windows. It was at that moment made bright by the setting sun. So the sun will be shining then, too, I suppose. The thought flashed through Raskolnikov's head as though involuntarily. He glanced quickly all over the room to make sure that he remembered as much as possible of its arrangement. But there was nothing of any particular interest in it. The old furniture of yellow wood consisted of a sofa with a huge arched wooden back, an oval table in front of the sofa, a dressing table with a small looking glass between the windows, chairs against the walls, and 2 or 3 pictures in yellow frames representing some German young ladies with birds in their hands. A little lamp was burning in the corner before an icon. Everything was very clean. The floors and the furniture were bright with polish. Everything shone. Lizaveta's work, thought the young man. There was not a speck of dust to be seen in the whole flat. It's always clean like that in the rooms of wicked old widows, Raskolnikov went on thinking to himself, and he stole a curious glance at the chintz curtain over the door leading into the second tiny room, with the old woman's bed and a chest of drawers into which he had never looked before. The whole flat consisted of these 2 rooms. "What do you want?" the old woman asked sternly, as she entered the room and stopped, as before, in front of him, so as to look him straight in the face. "I've brought something I want to pawn," said Raskolnikov, producing an old flat silver watch from his pocket. "Here it is." On the back of the watch was engraved a globe. The chain was of steel. "But why don't you redeem your old pledge? You should have done it at the end of the month, the day before yesterday. I'll bring you the interest on it for another month. Please wait a little." "That's as I think fit, sir. I could wait, or sell your pledge at once, just as I choose." "How much will you give me for the watch, Alyona Ivanovna?" "Why come to me with such junk? I don't suppose it's worth anything. I gave you 2 little notes for your ring last time, but I could have got a new one like it at a jeweler's for 1.5 rubles. Let me have 4 rubles on it. I'll redeem it. I promise you, it was my father's. I'll be getting some money soon. 1.5 rubles, and interest in advance. Take it or leave it." 1.5 rubles, cried the young man. "Please yourself," and the old woman handed him back the watch. The young man took it. He was so angry that he wanted to go away. But he changed his mind immediately, remembering that there was nowhere else he could go, and that besides he had come on quite a different errand. "All right," he said gruffly, "let's have it." The old woman fumbled in her pocket for her keys, and then went into the other room behind the curtain. Left standing alone in the middle of the room, the young man listened eagerly, trying to guess what the old woman was doing in the next room. He could hear her unlocking the chest of drawers. Must be the top drawer, he thought, so she carries the keys in her right pocket, all in one bunch on a steel ring, and one of the keys is bigger than the others, 3 times as big, with notches in its bit. Can't possibly be the key to a chest of drawers. There must be a box or a trunk there besides. That's interesting. All trunks have keys like that, and yet, good Lord, how beastly it all is. The old woman came back. "Here you are, sir. 10 kopecks a month on 1 ruble makes 15 kopecks on the 1.5 rubles. That's the interest you have to pay for the month in advance. And from the 2 rubles you had already borrowed, you owe me, on the same reckoning, another 20 kopecks in advance. That makes 35 in all. So that now I have to give you, for the watch, 1 ruble and 15 kopecks. Here's the money, sir." "How do you mean, only 1 ruble and 15 kopecks now?" "That's right, sir." The young man took the money without further argument. He looked at the old woman without being in a hurry to go, as though there was something else he wanted to say or do, but he did not seem to know himself what that was exactly. "I shall probably bring you something else in a day or 2, Alyona Ivanovna. Something good, a cigarette case, a silver one, as soon as I get it back from a friend of mine." He grew confused and fell silent. "Very well, sir, we'll talk about it when you bring it. Good-bye, are you always alone at home? I mean, isn't your sister in?" he asked, trying to sound as casual as possible, as he went out into the passage. "And what business have you with her, sir?" "Oh, nothing in particular. I just asked, and you at once— Good-bye, Alyona Ivanovna." Raskolnikov went out feeling decidedly ill at ease. His embarrassment grew stronger and stronger. Going down the stairs, he even stopped a few times, as though suddenly struck by some thought, and at length, when he was already in the street, he cried, "Good Lord, how disgusting it all is! And will I really? No, it's impossible, it's absurd," he added firmly. "And how could such a horrible idea have occurred to me? What a foul thing my heart is capable of, though. Yes, the chief thing is it's so foul, so horrible, so disgusting, disgusting. And yet, to think that for a whole month But he could not express his agitation in words or sounds. The feeling of disgust which had begun to oppress and disturb his mind, even while he was on his way to the old woman, had by now reached such intensity, and had become so palpable, that he simply did not know what to do with himself. He walked along the pavement as though he were drunk, without noticing the passers-by, and bumping into them, and he recovered his senses only when he reached the next street. Looking round, he became aware that he was standing next to a public-house, which one entered straight from the pavement by some steps leading to a basement. Just at that moment, two drunken men came out of the door of the public-house. They came up the steps to the street, supporting and abusing each other. Without another thought, Raskolnikov at once went down the steps. He had never been to a public-house before, but now he felt dizzy, and besides, he was tormented by a parching thirst. He felt a sudden craving for a glass of cold beer, all the more so since he attributed his present sudden weakness to his being hungry. He seated himself in a dark and dirty corner, at a sticky little table, ordered some beer, and drank the first glass eagerly. He felt better immediately, and his mind became clear. The whole thing's silly, he said to himself hopefully, and there was nothing to be so embarrassed about. Just feeling a bit off color. A glass of beer, a rusk, and hey presto, your mind's working normally. Your thoughts are wide awake, and your resolution is as firm as a rock. Lord, how absurd it all is. In spite of his annoyance with himself, he was already looking very cheerful, as though he had suddenly got rid of some terrible burden, and he cast a friendly glance at the people in the public-house. But even at that moment he could not help feeling rather vaguely that this tendency of his to take a cheerful view of things was itself morbid. There were only a few people in the public-house at the time. In addition to the two men he had met on the steps, a whole crowd of people, about 5 men with a concertina and a girl, had left as soon as he had come in. After they had gone, the public-house looked empty and quiet. Of the remaining people, one man, an artisan by the look of him, was sitting at a table and drinking beer. He was only slightly drunk, but his friend, a huge fat man with a grey beard and a closely fitting pleated coat, and a high stiff collar, was very drunk indeed. He was dozing on the bench. Only occasionally would he suddenly come to life, and as though still in his sleep, begin snapping his fingers, his arms wide apart and bobbing up and down with the upper part of his body, without getting up from the bench. While doing this, he would hum some meaningless snatches of song, trying in vain to remember the words, such as, "My wife a whole year I cuddled, my wife a whole year I cuddled," or suddenly, waking up again, "As I walked down the street, my first love I did meet." But no one seemed to share his high spirits. His silent friend regarded all these outbursts of his with undisguised distaste and suspicion. There was another man who, judging from his appearance, seemed to be some kind of retired civil servant. He sat apart from the rest, in front of his pint of vodka, taking a drink from time to time and looking round. He, too, seemed somewhat agitated. Raskolnikov was not used to crowds, and as has already been mentioned, he avoided every kind of society, more especially of late. But now he felt a sudden desire for company. Something new seemed to be happening to him, and at the same time he felt a sort of craving for people. He was so exhausted after a whole month of concentrated wretchedness and gloomy excitement, that he yearned for a chance of breathing freely, if only for a moment, in a different world, any world but his own. And in spite of the filthiness of his surroundings, he was now glad to stay a little longer in the public-house. The landlord was in another room, but he often appeared in the main room, coming down some steps from somewhere, so that one first caught sight of his handsome pair of tarred boots with large red turned-over tops. He wore a long pleated coat and a terribly greasy black satin waistcoat, and no tie, and his face seemed to be thickly covered with oil, like an iron lock. Behind the bar was a boy of 14, and there was also another boy there, a little younger, who waited on the customers. On the bar were some sliced cucumbers, black rusks, and some fish cut up into small pieces. All this smelt horribly. It was so stuffy that one could hardly bear to sit there, and everything was pervaded by so strong an odor of alcohol that one could, it would seem, have got drunk in 5 minutes from merely breathing the air. There are meetings with total strangers, in which we take an interest from the very first moment, all of a sudden, as it were, before a word has been spoken. Exactly such an impression was made on Raskolnikov by the man who was sitting some distance away from him, and who looked like a retired civil servant. The young man often recalled the first impression of his afterward, and even explained it as a kind of presentiment. He glanced incessantly at the civil servant, which no doubt was partly due to the fact that the man too kept staring at him, stolidly, and indeed it was plain enough that he wanted to enter into conversation. The civil servant regarded the other people in the room, including the landlord, with a bored expression mingled with a certain haughty disdain, as though they belonged to a much lower class of people who were not as well educated as he, so that it was not even worth his while talking to them. He was a man of over 50, of medium height and rather thick set, with hair that was going grey, and a large bald patch on his head, with the yellow, even greenish, bloated face of the confirmed drunkard, and swollen eyelids, out of which, as though through 2 narrow slits, shone a pair of tiny but animated reddish eyes. There was something very odd about him. His eyes seemed to glitter with a kind of exultation. There was perhaps some understanding and intelligence in them, but at the same time there was also something that looked very much like madness. He was wearing an old and very tattered black frock coat, with all but one of the buttons missing. This button, which clung precariously to his coat, he had fastened, evidently anxious to keep up appearances. A terribly crumpled, dirty, and stained shirt-front protruded from under his nankeen waistcoat. His face had been shaved in the manner of civil servants, but that must have been a long time ago, for a bluish stubble was already covering it thickly. In his manner, too, there was something that betrayed the sedate civil servant. But he seemed to be restless. He ruffled his hair, and occasionally, in a fit of depression, propped his head on his hands, leaning his ragged elbows on the wet and sticky table. At last he looked straight at Raskolnikov. "May I speak to you, sir, as one gentleman to another?" he said in a loud and firm voice. "For though, if I may say so, you don't look like a person of consequence, my experience of life tells me that you are a man of education, and one, moreover, who is not used to drink. I myself have always respected learning when combined with true feeling, and I may add, sir, that I am a titular councillor. Marmeladov's the name, rather an unusual name. A titular councillor. May I ask, have you ever been a member of the civil service yourself?" "No, I'm studying," replied the young man, a little taken aback by the pompous manner of the stranger's speech, and it being addressed so directly, so point-blank as it were. Though only a short while ago he had been for a moment overcome by a sudden longing for any sort of human companionship. He could not, at the first words addressed to him, restrain the all too familiar, unpleasant and irritating feeling of aversion for any stranger who tried to encroach on his privacy. "Ah, so you're a student, or you've been a student at any rate," cried the civil servant. "I thought so. Experience, sir, long experience." And he pressed a finger to his forehead, to show how pleased he was to have been right. "Been a student, or taken a university course of some kind. Allow me." He raised himself a little, swayed, took hold of his jug of vodka and his glass, and joined the young man at his table, sitting down on the other side of it and facing him a little sideways. Though drunk, he was still able to speak fluently and volubly, except perhaps for getting a little muddled now and again, and articulating a little more slowly than was natural. He pounced on Raskolnikov eagerly, as though he too had not spoken to a soul for a whole month. "Sir," he began with solemnity, "poverty is not a crime, that's true. Of course I know that drunkenness isn't a virtue either, and that that's even truer. But destitution, sir, chronic destitution is a crime. When you're poor, you're still able to preserve the innate nobility of your feelings, but when you're destitute you never can. For being destitute, a man is not even driven out with a stick, but is swept out with a broom from the society of decent people, in the most humiliating way possible. And quite right, too, for when I'm down and out, I'm ready to be the first to humiliate myself. Hence the pub. You see, sir, a month ago, Mr. Lebeziatnikov raised his hand against my dear wife, beat her black and blue, and my wife is quite a different sort of person from me. You see what I mean, don't you? Allow me to ask you, sir, out of simple curiosity, you understand, whether you've ever spent a night on the river, on the hay barges, I mean." "No, I don't think I have," replied Raskolnikov. "What is it like?" "Well, I've just come from there. Yes, sir, I've spent 5 nights there." He filled his glass, emptied it, and fell silent, immersed in his own thoughts. As a matter of fact, bits of hay could still be seen sticking here and there to his clothes and hair. It was indeed very probable that he had not undressed or washed for the last 5 days. His hands especially were filthy, fat red hands with black nails. His conversation seemed to have attracted the attention of the people in the pub, though no one appeared to be particularly interested in it. The young lads behind the bar began to snigger. The landlord apparently came down from the upper room for the express purpose of listening to the comic fellow, and sat down a little distance, yawning lazily, though with rather an important air. Marmeladov was obviously an old customer here. He must indeed have acquired his pompous manner of speech from the habit of frequently addressing all sorts of strangers in pubs. With some drinking men, and especially with those who are bullied and bossed about in their homes, this habit becomes second nature. That is why, when they find themselves in the company of other drinking men, they always try, as it were, to justify themselves in their eyes, and if possible even gain their esteem. "What a comic," the landlord said in a loud voice. "And why ain't you working? Why ain't you got a job, seeing as how you're a civil servant?" "Why haven't I got a job, sir?" Marmeladov repeated, addressing himself exclusively to Raskolnikov, as though it had been he who had asked him the question. "Why haven't I got a job? But, my dear sir, do you really think that my vile and unprofitable life doesn't make my heart bleed? A month ago, when Mr. Lebeziatnikov laid his hands on my dear wife, while I lay blind drunk in the same room, do you imagine for a moment, sir, that I did not suffer? I hope you don't mind my putting this question to you, my dear young man, but have you ever had occasion to, ask someone for a loan without the ghost of a chance?" "Yes, I think so, except that I don't quite see what you mean without a ghost of a chance." "What I mean is that there isn't the ghost of a chance of your ever getting any money, because you know perfectly well that nothing will come of it. Now let us say, for instance, that you knew beforehand, for certain, mind you, that a highly respected and by no means useless fellow citizen of yours will on no account lend you any money, for why, I ask you, should he? He knows perfectly well that I shan't give it back to him. Out of pity? But Mr. Lebeziatnikov, who keeps abreast of modern ideas, explained the other day that in our age even pity has been outlawed by science, and that in England, where they seem to be very keen on political economy, people are already acting accordingly. Why, then, I ask you, should he give you any money? And yet, knowing very well that he won't give you any, you set out all the same and—" "But why?" Raskolnikov could not help asking. "Why? But what if you have no one to see, and nowhere to go? A man must have somewhere to go, for there comes a time when a man simply has to go somewhere. When my own daughter went out on the streets for the first time, I had to go, too, for my daughter," he added parenthetically, looking uneasily at the young man. "For my daughter is a certified woman of the streets, not that it matters," he hastened to add immediately, and apparently without the slightest embarrassment, when the two boys behind the counter gave a splutter, and the landlord himself could not refrain from smiling. "It doesn't matter a bit. I'm not at all downcast by the general shaking of heads, for all this has long been common knowledge, and all the hidden things have been brought to light, and it is not with contempt but with a humble and contrite heart that I look upon it. So be it, so be it. Behold the man. Allow me to ask you, sir, can you—but no, let me put it more explicitly and more bluntly, too. Not can you, but dare you, sir, looking upon me at this very minute, dare you, I say, tell me positively that I'm not a dirty swine?" The young man said nothing in reply. "Well, sir," the orator went on gravely, and with an even greater air of dignity this time, after the sniggering that had followed his last declaration had died down. "Well, sir, all right, I am a dirty swine, but my dear wife is a lady. I may be a beast, but my dear wife, Katerina Ivanovna, is a highly educated lady, and the daughter of an army officer. Granted, I am a scoundrel, but she, sir, is an educated lady, of high character and noble sentiments, and yet, oh, if only she'd take pity on me. For surely, surely, my dear sir, every man ought to have at least one place where people take pity on him. But my dear wife, generous lady though she is unjust. And though I realize myself that when she pulls me by the hair she does it solely out of pity, for let me tell you frankly, young man, she does pull me by the hair," he reaffirmed with even greater dignity at the sound of renewed snickering in the room. "But, dear Lord, if only once in a while she'd—but no, no, it's all in vain, it's no use talking. For many a time has my prayer been granted, and many a time have people taken pity on me, but I'm afraid that's the sort of person I am, sir. I am a born blackguard." "Hear, hear," the landlord observed with a yawn. Marmeladov brought down his fist with a bang on the table. "That's the sort of person I am. Why, do you know, sir, do you know that I've even sold her stockings to pay for my drink? Her stockings, mind you, not her shoes. That at any rate would be in the order of things, but her stockings. Sold her stockings for a drink. She had a lovely mohair shawl. It was a present, didn't belong to me at all. She had it given to her before her marriage. And I sold that too. And we live in a cold room, and last winter she caught a chill and started coughing. And spitting blood, too. We have 3 little children, and my wife works from morning till night, scrubbing, washing, keeping the little mites clean. For you see, she's been used to cleanliness ever since she was a child herself, and all that with her weak chest and disposition to consumption. And of course I feel it. The more I drink the more I feel it. That's why I drink, for it is in drink that I'm trying to find sympathy and compassion. It is not happiness but sorrow that I seek. I drink, sir, that I may suffer more and more." And he laid his head on the table as though in despair. "Young man," he went on, raising his head again, "I can see from your face that you too are unhappy. The moment you came in I saw it. And that was why I turned to you at once. For in telling you the story of my life, I do not want to be laughed to scorn and mocked at by these idle fellows here, who know everything already. But I am looking for a man of education and feeling. You ought to know, then, that my wife was educated at a high school for young ladies of gentle birth, and that at the prize-giving ball she danced with a shawl in the presence of the governor of the province and other persons of quality, for which she received a gold medal and a certificate, in which her good conduct and scholastic attainments were highly praised. The medal we sold, a long time ago, and the certificate she still keeps in her trunk. She showed it to our landlady not so very long ago, for though she was always quarrelling with the landlady, she wanted to show off before someone at least, and to recall the happy days of her past. And I don't blame her, good Lord, I don't blame her in the least, for all she has left is just this memory of her past happiness, everything else having gone to rack and ruin. Yes, indeed, a high-spirited, proud, and relentless lady. Scrubs the floor herself, eats nothing but black bread, but will not put up with any disrespect to her person. That is why she would not overlook Mr. Lebeziatnikov's rudeness to her. And when Mr. Lebeziatnikov gave her a beating, she took to her bed, because her feelings were hurt, rather than because of the blows she had received. When I married her, she was a widow with 3 little children. Her first husband, an army officer she had married for love, eloped with him. She was very much in love with her husband, but he started gambling, playing cards, was put on trial for squandering public funds, and died. He used to beat her at the end, and although she gave as good as she got, which I know for a fact and from documentary evidence, she still speaks of him with tears and reproaches me with him. And I'm glad, for at least in her imagination she still thinks of herself as having once been happy. And so, after her first husband's death, she was left with 3 small children in a wild and remote part of the country, where I too happened to be at the time, and she was left in such a state of hopeless destitution that though I have witnessed all sorts of vicissitudes in my life, I am quite incapable of describing it. Her relations had all abandoned her, didn't even want to know her, and besides, she was proud, inordinately proud. It was then, my dear sir, it was then I, a widower myself, and the father of a 14-year-old daughter, asked for her hand in marriage, for I could not bear to see such suffering. You can well judge how desperate her position was from the fact that she, a well-bred and educated woman of good family, should have consented to marry me. But she did, weeping and sobbing and wringing her hands. She married me, for she had nowhere else to go. Do you understand, sir? Do you realize what it means when you have nowhere to go? No, that you don't understand yet. And for a whole year I did my duty by her conscientiously and well, and never touched a drop of this," he pointed to the half-pint, "for I have my feelings. But I'm afraid even that did not please her. And then I lost my job, through no fault of my own, but through changes in personnel at the office, and it was then that I took to drink. It is 16 months now since we found ourselves at last, after many wanderings and innumerable tribulations, in this resplendent capital city, adorned with so great a number of public monuments. And here too I got a job. Yes, sir, I got a job, and I lost it again. Do you understand? This time I lost my job through my own fault, for my weakness had got the better of me. And so now we live in a corner of a room in Amalia Lippeveshel's. But how we live, or what we pay our rent with, I do not know. Lots of other people live there besides us. A dreadful place, a veritable bedlam. Yes, sir. Well, in the meantime, my daughter by my first marriage grew up, and what that daughter of mine had to suffer at the hands of her stepmother while she was growing up, that, sir, I'd rather not talk about. For though my wife is a lady of the most exalted sentiments, she is very quick-tempered and irritable, and she likes putting people in their place. Yes, sir. But I'd rather not talk about it. As you can imagine, Sonia has no education. I did try about 4 years ago to teach her geography and world history, but I'm afraid I'm not very well up on these subjects myself, and we did not have the right sort of textbooks for what books we have. Well, anyway, we haven't got them any more. And so that was the end of her education. We got as far as Cyrus of Persia. Then, since she came of age, she has read a number of books of a romantic nature, and more recently still she has read with great interest another book which she got through Mr. Lebeziatnikov, George Lewes' Physiology. Do you happen to know it, sir? She has even read some extracts from it aloud to us. That's all the education she has had. Now, my dear sir, I should like, if you don't mind, to ask you a question of a general nature. How much do you think a poor but respectable girl can earn by honest work? She won't earn 15 kopecks a day, sir. If that is, she really is respectable and has no special talents, and to earn that she would have to work day and night, and even then State Councillor Klopstock, Ivan Ivanovitch Klopstock, have you heard of him? Not only refused to pay her for half a dozen shirts she made him, but turned her out of his house with insults, stamping and calling her all sorts of names, his excuse being that the shirt collars were not of the right size and were sewn on crookedly. And at the time the little children have nothing to eat, and my wife walks up and down the room wringing her hands, and the hectic spots come out on her cheeks, which always happens in that kind of illness. Just look at her, she said, living with us, eating and drinking, and kept snug and warm, the lazy slut. Though what the poor thing could have been eating and drinking when the little children did not have a crust for the last 3 days, I don't know. I was lying on the bed just then. Well, why keep it dark? I was dead drunk at the time. And suddenly I heard my Sonia, like a little lamb she is, the poor child, and her voice, too, so meek. She has fair hair, and her face has always been so thin and pale. Well, she said, you don't want me to do that, do you? And Darya Frenzovna, a wicked woman who's been in trouble with the police, had several times already been making inquiries about her through our landlady. Why, my wife replied jeeringly, what's so terrible about that? Who are you keeping it for? What a treasure! But don't blame her, sir, don't blame her. She was not in her right mind when she said it. She was beside herself, and ill, too, and the children were hungry and crying, and she didn't mean it, really. Just wanted to say something humiliating. She can't help herself, I'm afraid. It's her character, you see. And when the children begin to cry, even if it is only because they're hungry, she at once starts beating them. And so at about 6 o'clock I saw Sonia get up, put on her coat and a shawl, and leave the room, and about 9 o'clock she came back. She came back, went straight up to my wife, and put 30 roubles on the table before her without uttering a word. Not a word did she utter, nor did she even look at my wife, but just took our large green drap-de-dames shawl. We have such a shawl which we all use, a drap-de-dames shawl. Put it over her head and face, and lay down on her bed, with her face to the wall, her thin shoulders shaking all the time. And I, sir, was just lying there as I did before, dead drunk. And it was then, young man, that I saw my wife, also without uttering a word, walk up to Sonia's bed, go down on her knees, and kiss Sonia's feet. And the whole evening she was on her knees, kissing Sonia's feet and refusing to get up. And eventually they both fell asleep in each other's arms. The two of them. Yes, sir, the two of them, and me lying there drunk as a lord. Marmeladov fell silent, as though his voice had suddenly failed him. Then he quickly filled his glass, emptied it, and cleared his throat. Since then, my dear sir, he went on after a short pause, Since then, as a result of one unfortunate occurrence, and a certain information being laid with the police by some ill-disposed persons, Darya Frenzovna taking a leading part in it all because she didn't think we had shown proper respect to her, since then my daughter, Sofia Semyonovna, was forced to register herself as a prostitute, and because of that she can no longer stay with us, for you see our landlady would not allow it, though at first she had been in league with Darya Frenzovna herself. And Mr. Lebeziatnikov, too, well, yes. It was indeed on account of Sonia that all the unpleasantness between him and my wife took place. At first, mind you, he himself had done his best to seduce Sonia, but now he suddenly mounted his high horse. How can an educated man like me, he said, live in the same flat with a girl like that? and my wife, of course, could not let such a remark pass without taking Sonia's part, and then it all happened. Now my little Sonia comes to see us mostly after dark, helping my wife with the children and the housework, and contributing as much as she can spare from her earnings. She herself lives with the Kapernamovs, has a room in their flat. Kapernamov is a tailor, a cripple, and he stutters too. Indeed, all his numerous family are stutterers. His wife too stutters. They all live in one room, and Sonia has a room of her own with a partition. Well, yes, very poor they are, and all of them stutter, yes. As soon as I got up this morning, sir, I put on my rags, lifted up my hands to heaven, and went to see His Excellency, Ivan Afanasyevitch. Do you happen to know His Excellency, Ivan Afanasyevitch, sir? No? Well, in that case, you do not know a really good man. He's wax, wax in the face of the Lord. As wax he melteth. Shed tears he did, after he had graciously heard me out. Well, Marmeladov, he said, you've disappointed me once, but I'm going to give you another chance, now, on my own responsibility. That's what he said to me, sir. Remember, he said, and now you can go. I kissed the ground he trod on, metaphorically speaking, of course, for he would never have allowed it, being a high permanent official and a man of modern statesmanlike and enlightened ideas. Well, sir, you cannot imagine the joy when I returned home and announced that I had been given back my job in the civil service, and would be drawing a regular salary. Marmeladov once more fell silent in great agitation. Just then a whole crowd came in from the street, all of them drunk already, and from the entrance to the pub came the shrill voice of a 7-year-old boy singing a popular song. It got noisy. The landlord and the 2 boys began serving the customers. Taking no notice of the new arrivals, Marmeladov went on with his story. He seemed to have grown very weak, but the more he drank the more talkative he became. The recollection of his recent success in getting back his old job seemed to revive him, and was even reflected on his face in a kind of radiance. Raskolnikov listened attentively. That was 5 weeks ago, sir. Yes, 5 weeks ago. As soon as the 2 of them, my wife and Sonia, heard of it, why, bless my soul, it was as if I'd found myself in the kingdom of heaven. Before, I used to lie about like a drunken beast, and I heard nothing but abuse. But now they were walking on tiptoe, keeping the children quiet. Your father has come back tired from the office. He is resting. Hush. Made me coffee before I went to the office. Coffee with boiled cream. Real cream, sir, real cream. And goodness only knows where they got the money for a decent rig out for me. 11 roubles and 50 kopecks. Boots, linen shirt fronts, first-class stuff, a civil service uniform. Got it all up in the best possible style for 11 roubles and 50 kopecks, sir. Yes, sir. The first day I arrived from the office in the early afternoon, my wife had an excellent 2-course dinner ready for me. Soup and salt beef with horseradish sauce, which we had not even dared to dream of till then. She has no dresses of any kind, none at all, as a matter of fact. And here she suddenly had dressed up as though she were going out on a visit. And mind you, she didn't get herself a new dress, but seemed to be able to make something out of nothing. Done up her hair, got herself a nice clean little collar, cuffs, and she looked quite a different person, much younger and prettier. Sonia, my little darling, had helped us only with money. At present, she said, I don't think I'd better come and see you too often, just in the evening, perhaps, so that no one can see. Do you hear that? Do you hear? That afternoon I came home to have a nap, and whom do you think I find there but our landlady? My wife had invited her for a cup of coffee. Only a week before she had had a terrible row with her, but now she asked her in for a cup of coffee. The 2 of them sat for hours together, whispering to each other all the time. My wife told her the whole story. My husband's now in the service again, and he's receiving a salary. He's been to see His Excellency, and His Excellency himself came out and told everybody to wait, and led my husband by the arm into his private office with all the rest looking on. Can you beat it? I remember your past services, of course, he said, and though you've let your unfortunate weakness get the better of you, I'm willing to give you another chance, more especially as things have been going from bad to worse without you here. Can you beat it? And I hope I can rely on your word as a gentleman. You see, she made the whole thing up, and not because she's an irresponsible sort of person, but because she dearly wanted to show off. And mind you, she wasn't lying either. No, sir, she believed every word of it. She was merely comforting herself with her own fancies. And I'm not blaming her in the least. No, sir, I can't blame her for that. 6 days ago, when I received my first pay, 23 roubles and 40 kopecks, I gave her the lot. She called me her sweet little darling. Oh, you sweet little darling, she said. And when we were alone, too, you understand. I mean, I can't possibly pass myself off for a handsome man, could I? And what sort of husband am I, anyway? But she even pinched my cheek. You sweet little darling, she said. Marmeladov paused, trying to smile. And suddenly his chin began to twitch. He controlled himself, however. The pub, the dissipated appearance of the man, the 5 nights on the hay barges, the pint of vodka, and at the same time this morbid attachment to his wife and family, bewildered Raskolnikov, who listened intently, but with an uncomfortable feeling. He was sorry he had gone there. My dear sir, cried Marmeladov, recovering himself. My dear sir, perhaps all this sounds very funny to you, as indeed it does to other people, and perhaps I'm only worrying you with the silliness of all these miserable details of my family life. But believe me, it isn't funny so far as I'm concerned, for I can feel it all. And the whole of that heavenly day of my life I too indulged in vain dreams. I mean, how I was going to arrange it all, get some decent clothes for our little ones, make my wife's life more comfortable, and save my daughter from her life of dishonor and restore her to the bosom of her family. And so on and so forth. It's understandable, sir. Well, my dear sir. Marmeladov seemed to give a sudden start, raised his head, and looked straight at his listener. Well, on the very next day, after all those beautiful dreams, I mean exactly 5 days ago, in the evening, I, like a thief in the night, stole, by a cunning trick, the key from my wife's trunk, took out what was left of my salary, I can't remember how much it was, and now look at me, all of you. I've not been home for 5 days, and they are looking for me there. And my job is gone, and my civil service uniform is now at the pub by the Egyptian bridge, and in exchange I received these garments. And all's finished. Marmeladov smote his forehead with his fist, clenched his teeth, closed his eyes, and leaned heavily with his elbow on the table. But a minute later the expression of his face underwent a sudden change, and he looked at Raskolnikov with a sort of affected cunning and a reckless impudence. "I went to see Sonia today," he said with a laugh. "Asked her for some cash to take the hair of the dog that bit me. Ha ha ha!" "She didn't give it to you, did she?" someone shouted to him from across the crowd of people who had just come in, bursting out laughing at the top of his voice. "This half-pint of vodka, sir, was bought with her money," Marmeladov said, addressing himself exclusively to Raskolnikov. 30 kopecks. Gave them to me with her own hands. It was all she had. Saw it myself. She had nothing. She said nothing, only looked at me in silence. It's not on earth, but up there, that they grieve over people and weep. But they never blame them. And that hurts more. When they do not blame you. 30 kopecks. Yes, sir. And I expect she must need them badly now. Eh? What do you think, my dear sir? She's got to be very careful about her appearance now, hasn't she? Extra careful. Must be neat and clean. And that special sort of cleanness and neatness costs money, doesn't it? You see that, don't you, sir? And she has to buy some make-up, too. And then there are her petticoats, starched ones, a pretty shoe, something nice and attractive to show off her little foot when stepping over a puddle. Have you any idea, sir? Have you any idea what all that cleanness means? Well, and here I am, her own father, her own flesh and blood, and I filched these 30 kopecks from her to buy myself a drink. And I'm having it, sir. I have had it, in fact. I've spent all her money on drink. Well, sir, who would have pity on a man like me? Are you sorry for me, sir, or not? Tell me, sir, tell me, are you sorry for me? Ha ha ha!" He wanted to refill his glass, but there was nothing left. His jug was empty. "Why should anyone be sorry for you?" cried the landlord, who was again standing beside them. The people in the pub had burst out laughing, and even swearing. Both those who had and those who had not been listening to him laughed and swore at the mere sight of the figure of the former civil servant. "Be sorry for me? Why should anyone be sorry for me?" Marmeladov suddenly cried in a loud voice, getting up from his seat with his arms outstretched, and looking like a man inspired, as though he had been just waiting for those words. "Why be sorry for me, you say? Well, you're right. I don't deserve any pity. I ought to be crucified and not pitied. But crucify him, O judge, crucify him, and having crucified him, have pity on him. Then I too will come to you to be crucified, for it's not joy I thirst for, but sorrow and tears. Do you think that this half-pint of yours has given me pleasure? It is sorrow that I sought at the bottom of it. Sorrow and tears. And I've found it, and I've tasted it. And he who takes pity on all men will also take pity on me. And he who understands all men and all things, he alone, he too is the judge. He will come on that day and ask, Where is the daughter who sacrificed herself for her wicked and consumptive mother, and for little children who were strangers to her? Where is the daughter who had pity on her earthly father, the disgusting drunkard, and who was not dismayed at his beastliness? And he will say, Come unto me, I have already forgiven you once, and now too your many sins are forgiven because you have loved much. And he will forgive my Sonia, he will forgive her, I know he will forgive her. I felt it deep down in my heart when I was with her just now, and he will judge all and will forgive them, the good and the bad, the wise and the meek. And when he has done with all of them, he will say unto us, Come forth ye too, come forth all ye who are drunk, come forth all ye who know no shame. And we shall come forth without being ashamed, and we shall stand before him. And he will say, O ye brutes, ye who are made in the likeness of the beast, and bear his mark upon you, come ye unto me too. And the wise men will say, and the learned men will say, Lord, why dost thou receive them? And he will say unto them, I receive them, O wise men, I receive them, O learned men, because not one of them ever thought himself worthy of it. And he will stretch forth his arm to us, and we shall fall down before him, and we shall weep. And we shall understand all, yes, we shall understand all, and all will understand, and my wife too, my wife will understand. Lord, thy kingdom come. And he sank down on the bench, weak and exhausted, without looking at anyone, as though oblivious of his surroundings and deep in thought. His words had created a certain impression. For a minute there was dead silence, but soon they burst out laughing and swearing again, delivered his judgment, talking through his hat, civil servant, and so on and so forth. Let's go, sir, Marmeladov said suddenly, raising his head and addressing Raskolnikov. See me home, please. Kozel's house, through the yard. Time I went back to my wife. Raskolnikov had been wanting to go for some time. He had himself thought of helping him. Marmeladov appeared to be much unsteadier on his legs than in his speech, and he leaned heavily on the young man. They had to walk only about 100 yards. The drunken man was more and more overcome with fear and confusion the nearer they got to his home. It isn't my wife I'm afraid of now, he muttered in his excitement. Nor do I care whether she pulls me by the hair or not. The hair's nothing. That doesn't worry me at all, I assure you. As a matter of fact, I'd like her to pull me by the hair. No, sir, that's not what I'm afraid of. It's her eyes I'm afraid of, her eyes. And also the red spots on her cheeks, and her breathing. Have you ever noticed how people with her illness breathe when they're excited? And the children's tears, too, frighten me. For you see, if Sonia has not taken them any food, then I don't know what will have happened. I'm not afraid of blows, Lord no, for you must know, sir, that far from hurting me, such blows are a real pleasure to me. I can't do without them. It's better like that. Let her beat me. It'll do her a world of good. Yes, it's better that way. Ah, here's the house, Kozel's house, the house of a locksmith, a wealthy German. Go on, take me. They crossed the yard, and went up to the 4th floor. The stairs grew darker and darker the higher they mounted. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and though there is no real night in Petersburg at that season of the year, it was very dark at the top of the stairs. A small grimy door at the very top of the stairs stood open. A candle end lit up a very poorly furnished room, about 10 feet in length. The whole of it could be seen from the landing. The room was in terrible disorder, with all sorts of rags, including children's old clothes, thrown about all over. An old sheet, full of holes, was stretched across one corner at the end of the room. Behind it was probably the bed. In the room itself were only 2 chairs, a very tattered sofa, covered with American cloth, with an old, unpainted and uncovered kitchen table in front of it. At the edge of the table stood a lighted candle end and an iron candlestick. The Marmeladovs lived in a separate room, it seemed, and not in the corner of a room, but the people who lived in the flat had to go through their room. The door leading to the other rooms or cubicles into which Mrs. Lippeveshel's flat was divided was ajar. People were shouting and making a noise there. There were sporadic outbursts of laughter. They seemed to be playing cards and drinking tea. Occasionally rather unceremonious words could be heard. Raskolnikov immediately recognized Marmeladov's wife. She was terribly emaciated, but rather tall, slim, and well-proportioned, with still beautiful brown hair, and true enough, a hectic flush on her cheeks. She was walking up and down the small room, her hands pressed to her bosom. Her lips were parched, and she was breathing irregularly and in short gasps. Her eyes glittered as though she were feverish, but her gaze was piercing and immobile, and her consumptive, excited face produced a most painful impression in the flickering light of the guttering candle. Raskolnikov thought she could not be more than 30, and she certainly was not the right sort of wife for Marmeladov. She had neither heard nor noticed them coming in. She seemed to be in a sort of coma, hearing and seeing nothing. It was very close in the room, but she had not opened the window. An awful stench came from the stairs, but the door on the landing was not closed. From the inner rooms, through the door, which had been left ajar, came clouds of tobacco smoke, but she went on coughing and did not close the door. The youngest child, a girl of 6, was asleep on the floor, her body twisted and her head resting on the sofa. A little boy, a year older, stood trembling and crying in the corner. He must have been given a hiding not long ago. The eldest child, a girl of 9, tall and thin as a matchstick, stood in the corner beside her little brother, with her wasted arm around his neck. She was wearing a thin and terribly torn chemise, and her bare shoulders were covered with an old woolen coat, which must have been made for her 2 years ago, for it barely reached to her knees now. She seemed to be trying to quieten the little boy. She was whispering something to him and doing her best to prevent him from whimpering again. At the same time her large dark eyes, which looked even larger in her emaciated and frightened little face, were watching her mother fearfully. Marmeladov did not go into the room, but knelt down in the doorway, pushing Raskolnikov in front of him. Seeing the stranger, the woman stopped absent-mindedly before him, recollecting herself for a moment and evidently wondering what he was doing there. But she must have immediately jumped to the conclusion that he was visiting the lodgers in the other rooms, for in that case he would, of course, have had to pass through their room. Having come to that conclusion, and taking no further notice of him, she went to shut the front door. But seeing her husband kneeling on the threshold, she uttered a piercing cry. "Oh!" she screamed, beside herself. "So you've come back, have you? You jailbird, you monster! And where's the money? What have you got in your pockets? Show me! And your clothes, they're not the same. Where are your clothes? Where's the money? Speak!" And she began to search him. Marmeladov at once held out his arms submissively and obediently, to make it easier for his wife to search his pockets. But there was nothing there. "Where's the money?" she screamed. "Good Lord, he hasn't spent it all on drink, has he? Why, there were 12 roubles in the trunk!" And in a frenzy she suddenly seized him by the hair and dragged him into the room. Marmeladov did his best to make it easier for her, by crawling meekly on his knees after her. "I enjoy it," he kept crying, shaken by the hair, and even once striking the floor with his forehead. "I enjoy it, sir. It doesn't hurt me at all. I enjoy it. I enjoy it." The little girl who was asleep on the floor woke up, and began to cry. The little boy in the corner, unable to restrain himself any longer, fled screaming to his sister, terrified and almost in a fit. The eldest girl was shaking like a leaf. "Spent it all on drink!" the poor woman cried in despair. "Spent everything, everything on drink! And he hasn't the same clothes on! And they are hungry! Hungry! Damn, damn, damn this life! And aren't you there? Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" She suddenly flung herself on Raskolnikov. "Straight from the pub. Been drinking with him, haven't you? You've been drinking with him. Get out of here!" The young man made haste to go without uttering a word. Besides, the inner door was flung wide open, and several curious people were looking in at it. Insolent laughing faces with cigarettes and pipes, and heads with skull caps on them appeared in the doorway. Figures could be seen in dressing gowns and light summer clothes verging on indecency. They laughed with great gusto, especially when Marmeladov, dragged by the hair, cried that he was enjoying it. Some of them even came into the room. At length an ominous shriek was heard. That was Amalia Lipovetschel herself, trying to push her way through the crowd, and deal with the matter in her own way, by frightening the poor woman out of her wits, for the 100th time, by an abusive order to get out of the room the next day. As he went out, Raskolnikov managed to put his hand into his pocket, grab as many coppers as he could, most of the change he had been given from the rouble in the public-house, and put them unobserved on the window-sill. But a few moments later, on the stairs, he changed his mind and was about to go back. "What the hell did I do that for?" he thought. "They have Sonia to look after them, and I want the money for myself." But realizing he could not possibly take the money back now, and that in any case he would not have taken it back even if he could, he dismissed the whole thing and went home. "Sonia must have her make-up," he went on thinking, walking along the street and smiling sardonically. "This cleanliness costs money. Well, I expect Sonia too will be bankrupt today, for her business involves great risks, just like hunting big game or gold prospecting, so that without my money they may not have had anything tomorrow. Dear Sonia, what a girl! What a gold mine they have found! And they are making jolly good use of it. Took it for granted, wept bitter tears, and then got used to it. Man gets used to everything, the beast." He pondered for a moment. "Well," he exclaimed involuntarily all of a sudden, "what if I am wrong? What if man isn't really a beast? Man in general, I mean. The whole human race, that is. For if he is not, then all the rest is just prejudice, just imagined fears, and there is nothing to stop you from doing anything you like. And that's as it should be." He woke up late the next morning after a disturbed night. His sleep had not refreshed him. He woke up feeling ill-humored, irritable, and cross, and he looked round his little room with hatred. It was a tiny cubicle, about 6 feet in length, which looked most miserable with its dusty yellowish paper peeling off the walls everywhere. It was, besides, so low that even a man only a little above average height felt ill at ease in it, fearing all the time that he might knock his head against the ceiling. The furniture was in keeping with the room. There were 3 old chairs, none of them in good condition, a painted table in the corner with a few books and notebooks so thickly covered with dust that it was clear they had not been touched for a long time, and lastly a huge clumsy sofa occupying almost the entire length of the wall, and stretching half across the room. The sofa, which had once been covered with chintz, but was now all tattered, was Raskolnikov's bed, and he often went to sleep on it just as he was, without undressing and without a sheet, covered by his old threadbare student's overcoat, with his head resting on a small pillow under which he had shoved whatever linen he possessed, clean and dirty, so as to raise it as high as possible. A small table stood in front of the sofa. It would have been difficult to sink lower or be more untidy, but in his present state of mind Raskolnikov found it even pleasant. He had withdrawn from the world completely, like a tortoise into its shell, and even the face of the maid whose duty it was to look after him, and who sometimes came into his room, exasperated him beyond endurance. This sort of thing often happens with a certain type of monomaniac who dwells too much on one single idea. His landlady had stopped sending up his meals for the last fortnight, and so far it had never occurred to him to go down and talk things over with her, though he went without his dinner. Nastasia, his landlady's maidservant and cook, was in a way rather glad of the lodger's present unsociable disposition. She had stopped sweeping and tidying up his room altogether, except perhaps for coming in sometimes with her broom casually once a week. It was she who woke him up now. "Get up, sir, get up," she shouted, bending over him. "Why, are you asleep? It's almost 10 o'clock. I've brought you your tea. Don't you want a cup of tea? You must be starving." The lodger opened his eyes, gave a start, and recognized Nastasia. "Who sent up tea, your mistress?" he asked, raising himself slowly and painfully on the sofa. "The mistress? Some hope." She put down her own cracked teapot, filled with stewed tea, before him, and placed 2 yellow lumps of sugar beside it. "Here, take this, please, Nastasia," he said, fumbling in his pocket (he had gone to sleep fully dressed), and extracting a few coppers from it. "And buy me a small white loaf, and, please see if you can't get me a small piece of sausage from the pork butcher's at the same time. Something cheap." "I'll fetch the bread for you in a jiffy, sir. But wouldn't you rather have some cabbage soup instead of sausage? I've some lovely cabbage soup left over from yesterday. Kept it specially for you, I did, but you came in so late. Lovely cabbage soup it is, sir." When the cabbage soup had been brought, and he started eating it, Nastasia sat down beside him on the sofa and began to chatter. She was a countrywoman, and very talkative. "Mistress wants to go and complain about you to the police, sir," she said. He knit his brows. "To the police? What does she want?" "You know what she wants. Haven't been paying your rent, have you? And you don't give up the room, either." "Oh, blast! That's the last thing I want," he muttered, grinding his teeth. "No, I'm afraid I can't let her do that. Not just now. She's a fool," he added aloud. "I'll go and have a talk to her to-day." "I dare say she's a fool, same as me. But why does a clever man like you lie about like a sack of coals, of no use to himself or anybody else? You used to give lessons to children before, didn't you? Well, why is it you do nothing now?" "But I am doing something," Raskolnikov said reluctantly and sternly. "Are you now? Well, what is it?" "Working." "What kind of work?" "I am thinking," he replied seriously after a short pause. Nastasia was convulsed with laughter. She had a keen sense of fun, and when amused she laughed silently, rocking to and fro and shaking like a jelly till she had had enough of it. "Thought up a lot of money, have you?" she said when able to speak at last. "You can't teach children without a... Besides, I don't care a damn whether I have lessons or not." "You shouldn't bite the hand that feeds you, sir. They don't pay you much for teaching children anyway," he went on, speaking with great reluctance, as though in answer to his own thoughts. "And you can't do a lot with a few coppers, can you? You don't want to get rich all at once, do you?" He gave her a strange look. "I do," he said firmly, after a pause. "I do want to get rich all at once." "Well, I never. If I were you, sir, I wouldn't be in such a hurry, or you might frighten people. Makes my flesh creep, I'm sure. So, shall I get you your white loaf, sir, or don't you want it now?" "Just as you like." "Good heavens, sir, I forgot all about it. There's a letter for you. Came while you were out yesterday." "A letter? For me? Who's it from?" "I'm sure I don't know, sir. I had to pay the postman 3 kopecks out of my own pocket. You will pay me back, won't you, sir?" "Give me the letter, for God's sake, quick!" Raskolnikov cried in great excitement. "Good Lord!" A minute later he had the letter in his hands. Just as he thought. From his mother in the province of Ryazan. He even turned pale as he took it from Nastasia. It was a long time since he had had a letter. But now there was something else that made his heart contract with pain. "For God's sake, Nastasia, go now. Here are your 3 kopecks, take them, and for God's sake, go at once." The letter shook in his hands. He did not want to open it in her presence. He wanted to be left alone with this letter. After Nastasia had gone, he quickly raised the letter to his lips and kissed it. Then he spent a long time poring over the handwriting on the envelope, over the small slanting handwriting, so familiar and dear to him, of his mother who had once taught him to read and write. He was not in a hurry to open it. He even seemed to be afraid of something. At last he opened it. It was a long, closely written letter, 2 ounces in weight, 2 large foolscap sheets of notepaper covered with very small writing. "My dear Rodya," wrote his mother, "it is over 2 months now since I had a good talk with you by letter, and I was so distressed about it that it kept me awake at night thinking. But I know you won't blame me for my unavoidable silence. You know how much I love you, dear. You are all we have in the world, Dunya and I. You are our only hope of a better and brighter future. You can't imagine what I felt when I learned that you had left the university some months ago, because you hadn't the means to keep yourself, and that you had lost your lessons, and had no other resources. What could I do to help you with my pension of 120 roubles a year? The 15 roubles I sent you 4 months ago I borrowed, as you know, from Mr. Vakrushin, one of the merchants here. He is a very nice man, and he used to be a good friend of your father's. But having renounced the claim to my pension in his favor, I had to wait till the debt was paid off, which I have only just been able to do. That is why I could not send you anything at all this time. But now, thank God, I think I shall be able to send you a little. And as a matter of fact, we can congratulate ourselves on our good fortune now, which piece of good news I make haste to share with you. But first of all, my dear Rodya, I wonder if you know that your sister has been living with me for the past 6 weeks, and that we shall never part again. Thank goodness her ordeal has come to an end. But I'd better tell you everything in order, so that you should know how it all happened, and what we have kept from you until now. When about 2 months ago you wrote to tell me that you had heard from someone that Dunya had to put up with a great many incivilities in the house of the Svidrigaïlovs, and asked me for full particulars about it, what could I have written to you in reply? If I had told you the whole truth, you would, I dare say, have thrown up everything and come to us, even if you had to walk all the way, for I know your character and your feelings very well, and I realized that you would never allow your sister to be humiliated. I was in despair myself, but what could I do? You see, my dear, I did not know the whole truth myself at the time. The chief trouble was, that when she took up her post as governess in their house last year, Dunya received an advance of 100 roubles on condition that the money would be deducted from her wages every month, and she could not, of course, leave her post without repaying her debt. And she took the money. I can explain everything to you now, my darling Rodya. Chiefly because she wanted to send you the 60 roubles that you wanted so badly at the time, and which you received from us last year. We deceived you then. We told you that the money was part of Dunya's savings, but that was not so. And now I can tell you the whole truth, because everything, thank God, has suddenly changed for the better, and because I want you to know how much Dunya loves you, and what a heart of gold she has. It is quite true that at first Mr. Svidrigaïlov was very rude to Dunya, and used to make all sorts of disrespectful and sneering remarks to her at table. But I don't want to dwell on all these painful details, because I don't want to worry you unnecessarily now when it's all over. To put it briefly, in spite of the fact that Dunya has been treated with great kindness and consideration by Mrs. Svidrigaïlov and the rest of the family, her position in the house was very difficult, especially when Mr. Svidrigaïlov, according to his old regimental habit, was under the influence of Bacchus. But the true reason for his deplorable manners came out later. Can you imagine it? The absurd man had for a long time been passionately in love with Dunya, but had concealed it all under a cloak of rudeness and contempt for her. Perhaps he was ashamed and horrified himself that a man of his age and a father of a family should cherish such a foolish hope, and that was why he could not help being angry with Dunya. But at last he could no longer restrain himself, and he had the impudence to make Dunya an open and shameful proposal, promising her all sorts of things, and in addition telling her that he was ready to leave everything and run away with her to some other village, or even abroad. You can imagine what an awful shock the whole thing was to her. She could not possibly leave her post at once, not only because of her unpaid debt, but also because she was anxious to spare Mrs. Svidrigaïlov, whose suspicions might have been suddenly aroused, and she would therefore be responsible for sowing discord in the family. And it would have meant a simply awful scandal for Dunya, too. That certainly could not have been avoided. There were all sorts of other reasons, besides, so that Dunya could not possibly count on escaping from that terrible house for 6 weeks at least. Of course you know Dunya, and you know what a clever and determined girl she is. Dunya can put up with a great deal, and even in the most difficult situations she can find enough magnanimity in her heart to remain firm. But the whole thing came to a head quite unexpectedly. Mrs. Svidrigaïlov accidentally overheard her husband imploring Dunya in the garden, and jumping to the wrong conclusion, put the whole blame on her, thinking that she was the cause of it all. A most awful scene took place between them there in the garden. Mrs. Svidrigaïlov even struck Dunya, and she would not listen to anything, but went on screaming for a whole hour, and finally gave orders for Dunya to be sent back to me in town immediately in a plain peasant's cart. They flung all her belongings into the cart, her linen and clothes and anything they happened to get hold of, without bothering to pack it or tie it up. And it started pouring with rain, and Dunya, humiliated and dishonored, had to drive with a peasant in an open cart for about 12 miles. Now, my dear, I hope you realize why I couldn't possibly have written to you anything in reply to your letter, which I received 2 months ago. And what could I have written? I was myself in despair. I dared not write to you the truth, for it would have made you very unhappy, and you would have been grieved and indignant. And what could you have done, anyway? You might have done something silly, and besides, Dunya forbade me to tell you anything. And to fill my letter with all sorts of tittle-tattle, when my own heart was on the point of breaking with grief, I could not. For a whole month the most absurd stories were spread in our town about this unfortunate affair, and things went so far that Dunya and I could not even go to church because of the whisperings and contemptuous looks. And there were occasions when people did not hesitate to talk aloud about it in our presence. All our friends abandoned us, nobody would even greet us in the street, and I learned for a fact that some shop assistants and office clerks were planning to add insult to injury by tarring the gates of our house, so that our landlord began to demand that we should move out of our flat. And the cause of it all was Mrs. Svidrigaïlov, who had succeeded in blackening Dunya's character in all the best houses in town. She knows everyone here, of course. And the cause of it all was Mrs. Svidrigaïlov, who had succeeded in blackening Dunya's character in all the best houses in town. She knows everyone here, of course, and she is continually coming into town, and she is a rather garrulous woman, and likes to tell everyone about her family's affairs, and especially complain about her husband, which I'm afraid is not nice at all. She spread the whole story in a short time not only all over the town, but all over the district. I fell ill, but Dunya was much braver than I. And if only you could have seen how she bore it all, and how she comforted and cheered me up. She's an angel, but through God's mercy, our sufferings were cut short. Mr. Svidrigaïlov came to his senses, and repented, and feeling sorry for Dunya, I suppose, presented his wife with complete and irrefutable proof of Dunya's innocence, namely, the letter which Dunya had been forced to write, and which she had handed to him to avoid the necessity of any personal explanations and secret meetings on which he was insisting. In this letter, which remained in Mr. Svidrigaïlov's possession after Dunya's departure, she reproached him most vehemently and indignantly with his ungentlemanly conduct toward his wife. She pointed out to him that he was a father of a family, and asked him to consider how odious it was of him to torment and make unhappy a girl who was defenseless and unhappy enough. In a word, dear Rodya, it was so nobly and movingly written that I could not help sobbing when I read it, and even to this day I cannot read it without tears. There was, moreover, the testimony of the servants, who at last finally exonerated Dunya from all blame, for they had seen and known a great deal more than Mr. Svidrigaïlov himself had imagined, as indeed is almost always the case with servants. Mrs. Svidrigaïlov was simply speechless with astonishment, and, as she told us herself, once more crushed. But on the other hand, she was now fully convinced of Dunya's innocence, and on the very next day, which was a Sunday, she came to town and went straight to the cathedral, where she knelt before the icon of the Blessed Virgin and besought her with tears to give her strength to bear this new trial, and to do her duty. Then, straight from the cathedral, and without calling on anyone, She came to us and told us everything, weeping bitterly, and fully penitent, embraced Dunya and implored her to forgive her. The same morning, without wasting any time, she went straight from us to pay visits to all the houses in town, and weeping profusely, she everywhere vindicated in most flattering terms Dunya's reputation, praising the nobility of her feelings and her behavior. What was more, she showed and read Dunya's letter to Mr. Svidrigaïlov to everybody, and even let people make copies of it, which was rather overdoing things, I thought. She had to stay several days in town, paying calls on everybody, for people were beginning to feel offended with her for showing a preference to some rather than to others, and in this way queues were formed, so that everybody knew beforehand when to expect a call from Mrs. Svidrigaïlov to read the letter, and every reading was attended by many people who had already heard the letter read several times in their own houses, and in the houses of their friends, all in strict rotation. I can't help thinking, dear, that much, very much, of all of this was quite uncalled for. But that's the sort of person Mrs. Svidrigaïlov is. At any rate, she completely vindicated Dunya's honor in the eyes of the world, and the whole blame for this disgraceful business has now fallen squarely on her husband, who will never be able to show his face again among honorable men, so that I am even sorry for him, for I can't help feeling that the absurd man has been punished a little too severely. Dunya at once received many offers to give lessons in private houses, but she refused. Generally, everyone all of a sudden began to treat her with marked respect. All this was the chief reason for the quite unexpected turn of events, which I may say has completely changed our prospects. For I must tell you now, dear Rodya, that Dunya has received an offer of marriage, and that she has already given her consent, of which I now hasten to inform you. And though all this has been arranged without your advice, I am sure you will not be too cross with me or your sister, for I hope you will agree that it was quite impossible for us to postpone Dunya's answer till we received a reply from you. And besides, I don't expect that you could have made up your mind without being present here yourself. It all happened like this. He is a civil servant, with the rank of a councillor, and his name is Peter Lushkin. He is a distant relative of Mrs. Svidrigaïlov's, and it was indeed she who was chiefly instrumental in arranging the marriage. It was through her that he first expressed his wish to be introduced to us, and of course we were very pleased to meet him. He had coffee with us, and the very next day we received a letter from him, in which he very courteously asked for Dunya's hand in marriage, and begged for a definite and speedy answer. He is a practical man and very busy, and he is now in a hurry to leave for Petersburg, so that every minute is precious to him. We were naturally very much surprised at first, for all this happened very quickly and unexpectedly. We spent the whole of that day discussing the matter, wondering what was the best thing to do. He is a very safe and reliable man, and has 2 official jobs, and already has money of his own. It is true he is 45 years old, but he is fairly good-looking, and I dare say women might still find him attractive. He is altogether a highly respectable and dignified man, though perhaps a little morose and overbearing. But quite possibly that is only the first impression he makes on people. And please, Rodya, dear, I must ask you not to judge him too hastily and too heatedly when you meet him in Petersburg, which will probably be very soon, as I'm afraid you're all too likely to do if something about him does not appeal to you at the first glance. I'm saying this, dear, just in case, for I'm quite sure that he will make a good impression on you, and besides, to get to know any man properly one must do it gradually and carefully, so as to avoid making a mistake of becoming prejudiced, for such mistakes and prejudices are very difficult to overcome and put right afterwards. Mr. Lushkin, to judge by many signs, is a highly worthy gentleman. He told us on his first visit that he was a practical man, but that, as he put it, in many things he shared the convictions of the younger generation, and was an enemy to all prejudices. He said a lot more, for he seems a little vain, and he likes people to listen to him, but that is hardly advice. I'm afraid I did not understand much of it, but Dunya explained to me that though he is not a man of great education, he is intelligent, and it seems kind-hearted. You know what your sister is like, Rodya. She is a strong-minded, sensible, patient, and generous girl, though apt to be carried away by her feelings, as I know very well from experience. There is, of course, no special love on her side or his, but Dunya is a clever girl, and as noble-minded as an angel, and she will consider it her duty to make her husband happy, and he too will probably do his best to make her happy. At least we have no good reason to doubt it, though I must say the whole thing has happened rather in a hurry. Besides, he is a very shrewd man, and he will of course realize that the happier he makes Dunya, the happier his own married life will be. As for a certain unevenness of his character, certain old habits, and even certain differences of opinion, which can hardly be avoided in the happiest marriages, Junia has told me herself that there is nothing to worry about, as she has full confidence in her own ability to put up with many things, provided their future relationship is honest and straightforward. He struck me at first, for instance, as rather harsh, but after all, that is probably because he is such an outspoken man, and indeed I am sure that is why. When he called on us the second time, for instance, after he had received Junia's consent, he said in the course of our conversation that even before meeting Junia, he had made up his mind to marry some honest girl who had no dowry, and one above all who had experienced extreme poverty. For, as he explained, a husband should never be under any obligation to his wife for anything, since it was much better if the wife looked upon her husband as her benefactor. I must in fairness add that he expressed himself much more mildly and more graciously than I have put it down, for I have forgotten his actual words and only remember his general idea. And besides, he did not say it deliberately, but it seemed just to have slipped out in the course of the conversation, so that later he even tried to correct himself and make it sound much nicer. But I could not help feeling all the same that it sounded a little too harsh, as I told Dunya afterwards. But Dunya replied, rather resentfully, that words are not deeds, which of course is quite true. Before she made up her mind to accept Mr. Lushkin, Dunya spent a sleepless night, and thinking that I was asleep, she got out of bed and walked up and down the room all night. At last she knelt down before the icon and prayed long and fervently, and the next morning she told me that she had decided to accept him. I believe I have told you already that Mr. Lushkin is leaving for Petersburg. He has important business there, and he intends to open a lawyer's office in Petersburg. He has been practicing law for many years, and he won an important case only the other day. He has to be in Petersburg now because he has a very important case coming up before the High Court. He may therefore, Radya dear, be very useful to you, too, in lots of ways. In fact, Dunya and I have already decided that even now you could start on your career, and regard your future as absolutely settled. Oh, if only that were so! This would be of so great an advantage to you that we must regard it as nothing less than a special sign of God's grace to us. Dunya can think of nothing else. We have even ventured to drop a few words about it to Mr. Lushkin. He answered rather cautiously that of course he could not do without a secretary. He would naturally prefer to pay a salary to a relation than to a stranger, provided he showed an aptitude for the job, as though you would not show an aptitude for it. But he did immediately express some doubts as to whether your university studies would leave you much time for work at his office. This is how the matter has been left for the time being, but Dunya is thinking of nothing else now. During the last few days, she seems to have been in a kind of fever, and she has already formed a whole plan about your becoming Mr. Lushkin's assistant later and even a partner in his legal business, particularly as you are studying law yourself. I agree with her entirely, Radya, and I share all her plans and hopes, for I don't see why they should not be realized. And in spite of Mr. Lushkin's present quite understandably evasive attitude, for he does not know you yet, Dunya is that she will be able to arrange everything because of her good influence on her future husband. She is quite sure of it. We, of course, were very careful not to say anything to Mr. Lushkin about these rather distant plans of ours, and especially about your becoming his partner. He is a practical man, and he might quite possibly have received it coldly, for the whole thing might appear to him rather in the nature of a daydream. Neither Dunya or I has breathed a word to him about our great hopes that he would help us to advance you some money for your university studies. We have said nothing about it, in the first place, because all this will arrange itself afterward, and most probably he will offer to do it himself without wasting any words. I can't imagine him refusing dear Dunya, can you? And particularly as you yourself might become his right hand in the office, and receive this assistance not as a charity, but as your well-earned salary. This is how Dunya hopes to arrange it, and I am completely in agreement with her. Secondly, we have said nothing about it to him, because I particularly want you to be on an equal footing when you meet him shortly. When Dunya spoke very enthusiastically about you to him, he replied that one could not form an opinion of anyone without getting to know him more intimately first, and that he hoped to form his own opinion about you when he meets you personally. You know, darling Radya, I can't help feeling that for a number of reasons, which incidentally have nothing to do with Mr. Lushkin, but are probably just my own personal old womanish whims, it would perhaps be much better if I lived on my own after their wedding, as I am doing now, and not with them. I am quite sure he would be so nice and considerate as to ask me himself to live with them, so as not to be separated from my daughter in that. And that if he has said nothing about it so far, it is simply because no other arrangement has even occurred to him. But I shall refuse. I have noticed many times in life that mothers-in-law are not particularly popular with their sons-in-law, and not only do I hate the idea of being in any way a burden to anyone, but I myself want to be entirely independent so long as I still have something to live on, and such children as you and Dunya. If possible, I shall live somewhere near the two of you. For the most pleasant piece of news, Radia, I have kept to the end of my letter. I want you to know, my dear, that we shall all be together very soon, and that we shall be able to embrace each other again, all three of us, after a separation of almost 3 years. It has been definitely settled that Dunya and I are to leave for Petersburg. I don't know when exactly, but at any rate soon, very soon, even within a week. Everything depends on the arrangements made by Mr. Lushkin, who will let us know the moment he has had time to look round in Petersburg. For certain private reasons of his own, he is anxious to get the marriage ceremony over as soon as possible, and if at all possible, celebrate the wedding soon after our arrival in Petersburg, and if that should prove impracticable, immediately after August 15th. Oh, how happy I shall be to press you to my heart! Dunya is terribly excited and happy to be able to see you so soon, and she even told me once, as a joke of course, that she'd gladly have married Lushkin for that alone. She is an angel. She is not writing anything to you now, but she has asked me to tell you that there is so much she wants to talk to you about that she is afraid to take up the pen, because she could not possibly tell you everything in a few lines, but would merely upset herself. She asks me to send you her love and lots of kisses. But though we shall be meeting so soon, I shall send you as much money as I can in a day or two. Now that the news of Dunya's forthcoming marriage to Mr. Lushkin has spread all over the town, my credit has suddenly improved, and I feel certain that Mr. Vakrushin will trust me now with an advance of 75 rubles on the security of my pension, so that I shall be able to send you 25 or even 30 rubles. I would send you more, but I'm afraid we should not then have enough for our traveling expenses. And though Mr. Lushkin has been so kind as to offer to defray some of our expenses himself, I mean he has offered to send on our luggage and large trunk, through some people he knows, at his own cost, we have to keep some money for our arrival in Petersburg, where we can't be left without a penny for at least the first few days. However, Dunya and I have calculated everything very carefully, and we find that the actual traveling expenses will not amount to very much. It is only about 60 miles from our town to the nearest railway station, and we have already, just to be on the safe side, made all the necessary arrangements with a peasant we know to take us there in his cart. From there, Dunya and I will travel third class, and I am sure we will enjoy our journey very much, so that I shall try some time or other to send you not 25, but quite certainly 30 rubles. Well, I think I'd better stop now. I have filled 2 sheets already, and I don't think there is any room left for more. The whole story of our lives. Anyway, there was heaps to write about. And now, Radia, my precious darling, let me embrace you till we meet again. Bless you, my darling. Love Dunya, Radia. Love your sister. Love her as she loves you, and remember she loves you very much, much more than herself. She is an angel, and you, Radia, are all we have in the world, our only hope of a better and brighter future. If only you are happy, we shall be happy. Do you still say your prayers, Radia, as you used to? And do you believe in the goodness and mercy of our Creator and our Redeemer? I am in my heart afraid that you may have succumbed to the influence of the modern spirit of godlessness. If so, then I pray for you. Remember, dear, how as a child, while your father was still with us, you used to lisp your prayers on my knees, and how happy we all were then. Goodbye, or rather au revoir. Let me hold you close to me, my darling, and kiss you again and again. Yours to the grave, Pulcheria Raskolnikov. Almost all the time he was reading the letter, from the very beginning, Raskolnikov's face was wet with tears. But when he had finished it, his face was pale and contorted, and a bitter, spiteful, evil smile played on his lips. He put his head on his pillow, and thought a long, long time. His heart was beating fast, and his thoughts were in a whirl. At last, he felt stifled and cramped in that yellow cubbyhole of his, which was more like a cupboard or a box than a room. His eyes and thoughts craved for more space. He grabbed his hat and went out, without worrying this time whether he met anyone on the stairs or not. He forgot all about it. He walked in the direction of Vasilyevsky Island, along Voznesensky Avenue, as though he were in a hurry to get there on some business. But as usual, he walked without noticing where he was going, muttering and even talking aloud to himself, to the astonishment of the passers-by, many of whom thought he was drunk. His mother's letter had worried him terribly, but about the main and fundamental point of it, he had no doubts at all, even while he was reading it. So far as the essential part of the matter was concerned, his mind was made up, and made up finally. While I am alive, this marriage will not take place, and to Helmut with Mr. Lushkin. For the whole thing is plain enough, he muttered to himself, grinning and already celebrating maliciously the success of his decision. No, mother, no, Dunya, you won't deceive me. And they even apologize for not asking my advice and settling everything without me. And no wonder. They believe that the engagement cannot be broken off now. Well, we shall see whether it can or cannot. What a marvelous excuse! Mr. Lushkin is such a busy man, such a terribly busy man, that even his wedding has to be arranged post-haste almost in a railway carriage. No, my dear Dunya, I see it all, and I know perfectly well what you want to talk to me about so much. And I know too what you were thinking about while walking up and down the room all night, and what you were praying for before the Kazan Virgin in Mother's bedroom. The ascent to Golgotha is certainly not so easy. No, so it's been finally settled, has it? So you are going to marry a practical business man, are you? A business man with money of his own, already with money of his own. That sounds ever so impressive and solid. Who has 2 government jobs and who shares the views of the younger generation, as Mother puts it. And it seems he is kind-hearted, as Dunya herself observed. That "it seems" is really marvelous, and dear Dunya is marrying him because of that "it seems." Splendid, splendid. I wonder, though, why Mother thought it necessary to put in that bit about the younger generation. Just to give me an idea what Mr. Lushkin was like, or did she have something else in mind? Did she want to influence me in favor of Mr. Lushkin? Oh, the cunning woman! And it would be interesting, too, to find out the truth about something else. How frank were they with one another that day and that night? And indeed, all during the following days. Were all the words that passed between them spoken frankly? Or did both of them realize that they felt and thought the same way, and that there was therefore no need for them to say everything aloud, and run the risk of saying something that was better left unsaid? Quite possibly that was more or less so. That can be seen from the letter. Mother had thought him a little harsh, and poor naive Mother immediately runs to Dunya with her observations, and Dunya quite naturally got angry, and replied resentfully, and no wonder! Who would not get furious when the whole thing was clear enough without any naive questions, and when it was understood that it was useless to talk about it? And why does she write to me, "Love Dunya, Radya, for she loves you more than herself"? Is it possible that her conscience is secretly pricking her, for agreeing to sacrifice her daughter to her son? You're our only hope, you're all we have. Oh, Mother, Mother! He was getting more and more worked up, and if he had come across Mr. Lushkin then, he would most probably have killed him. Well, I suppose that's true enough, he continued, following the train of his thoughts, which went whirling through his brain like a blizzard. It's true enough that a man must be approached gradually and carefully in order to know what he is like. But it is not difficult to see through Mr. Lushkin either. The main thing is that he is a business man, and it seems kind-hearted. Just think of it. He has offered to send on their luggage at his own expense, the big trunk included. Such a man could not possibly be unkind, could he? And in the meantime the 2 of them, the bride-to-be and Mother, are hiring a peasant and his cart covered with matting. I used to drive in just such a cart. But what does it matter? It's only 60 miles. And from there Dunya and I will travel 3rd class, and I'm sure we shall enjoy the journey very much. A journey of over 700 miles. And what could be more reasonable? You have to cut your coat according to your cloth. But what about you, Mr. Lushkin? She's your fiancée, isn't she? And couldn't you have found out that Mother had to borrow money for the journey on the security of her pension? But of course the whole thing being purely a business transaction, on a 50-50 basis, both as regards profits and investments, you have to share expenses equally, too. Share and share alike, as the saying is, and there, too, the business man has cheated them. The cost of sending on the luggage is less than the railway fares, and most likely he won't have to pay anything at all for it. Are they blind, both of them, or don't they notice anything on purpose? And how pleased they are, how pleased! And to think that this is merely, as it were, the blossoms, and that the real fruits will come later. For what is so important is not the horrible meanness of it, but the way it's done. For that's the way it will be after the marriage, is prophetic in fact. And Mother, what is she throwing her money about like that for? How much will she have left when she arrives in Petersburg? 3 gold rubles or 2 little notes, as that one the old woman says. Well, what does she think she's going to live on in Petersburg afterwards? For somehow or other she has already realized that she would not be able to live with Dunya after the marriage, under any circumstances, even for the first few weeks. The dear old fellow must somehow have let that slip out, too. Showed the kind of man he really was, though Mother, of course, would not admit it on any account. I shall myself refuse. Well, what is she counting on, then? On the 120 rubles of her pension, out of which she has to pay her debt to Vakrushin? She knits winter shawls and embroiders cuffs, ruining her old eyes. But all her shawls won't add more than 20 rubles a year to her 120. I know that. So they must be relying on Mr. Luzhkin's noble feelings. He's sure to offer it himself, sure to beg us to take the money. Some hope. And it's always like that with these beautiful Schiller-like souls, decking out a man in peacock's feathers to the bitter end, hoping for the best and not being prepared for the worst. And though they know very well what the reverse of the medal is, they will never admit it to themselves. The very thought of it frightens them. They would rather die than admit the truth, till the man they have themselves lauded up to the skies convinces them of their own folly. It would be interesting, though, to know whether any decorations have been conferred on Mr. Luzhkin. I bet he probably has a St. Anne's ribbon in his buttonhole, and that he wears it at the dinners given by contractors and merchants. No doubt he will wear it at his wedding, too. Oh, to hell with him! Well, of course, Mother can't help being the person she is. But Dunya. What about Dunya? Dear, dear Dunya, I know you so well. The last time I saw you, you were almost 20, and I could read you like a book even then. Mother writes, dear Dunya can put up with a lot. Well, I knew that. I knew it 2.5 years ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since for 2.5 years. Yes, thinking just of that Dunya can put up with a lot. If she could put up with Svidrigaïlov and all the consequences, she certainly can put up with a lot. And now she and Mother have taken it into their heads that she can put up with Mr. Luzhkin, too. Mr. Luzhkin, who favors the theory of the superiority of wives saved from a life of poverty and degradation by their husbands, and propounds this theory of his almost at their first meeting. Well, let us assume that it just slipped out, sensitive man though he is, so that it is quite likely that it did not slip out after all, but that he said it deliberately, being anxious to make his position absolutely clear as soon as possible. But what about Dunya? Dunya? She surely must see through that man. But she will have to live with him. Why, she'd rather live on bread and water than sell her own soul. And she'd certainly not exchange her moral freedom for a life of comfort. She would not exchange it for the whole of Schleswig-Holstein, let alone Mr. Luzhkin. No, the Dunya I knew was not that kind of a woman, and I don't expect she has changed even now. Goodness knows the Svidrigaïlovs are bad enough. It is bad enough to be a governess in the provinces all your life for 200 a year. But I know all the same that my sister would rather work as a slave for an American plantation owner, or as a Letzer for a Baltic German landowner, than debase her spirit and her moral feelings by a marriage to a man she does not respect, and with whom she has nothing in common, for her own personal advantage. And even if Mr. Luzhkin had been made of pure gold, or had been a diamond of the purest water, she would never have agreed to become his legal concubine. So why has she agreed to it now? What's the idea? What's the explanation? The whole thing is clear. She would never sell herself, for her own comfort. No, not even to save her life. But she would do it for someone else. She would sell herself for someone she loved, someone she worshipped. That's what's at the bottom of this whole business. For her brother and for her mother, she will sell herself. She will sell everything. Oh, in such a case we don't mind suppressing our moral feelings. Our freedom, our peace of mind, even our conscience. Everything, in fact, we shall be glad to put up for sale in the marketplace. Let my life be ruined so long as my loved ones are happy. And what is more, we are quite ready to invent our own casuistical reasons. We are ready to take a lesson from the Jesuits. And for a time, at least, we shall not even be plagued by our own thoughts. We shall persuade ourselves that there is no other way, that we really have to act like that for the sake of the good cause. That's the sort of people we are, and everything is as clear as daylight. It is clear that it is none other than Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov who occupies the center of the stage in all this business, and is indeed the principal actor in it. And really, what a fine chance of making him happy and contented, paying his university fees, making him a partner in a lawyer's office, making his whole future secure and safe. And who knows, he may be a rich man later on, an honored and respected citizen, and may even die famous. And Mother, why, it's Radia, isn't it? Darling Radia, her firstborn. Oh, the dear and over-generous hearts. Why, that's nothing. In such an emergency we would not even mind going the same way as Sonia. Dear little Sonia. Sonia Marmeladov, the eternal Sonia while the world lasts. Is either of you aware of the sacrifice you've made? Have you measured it fully? You have. But are you quite sure you have the strength to go through with it? Are you quite sure it is worth it? that it's reasonable. Do you, dear Dunya, realize that little Sonia's fate is in no way more degrading than yours with Luzhkin? There can be no question of love here, Mother writes. But what if there is not only no love there, but no respect either? If, on the contrary, there is already aversion, contempt, loathing, what then? Well, what follows, of course, is that again it's merely a question of keeping up a fresh and neat appearance. Isn't that so? Do you realize what this cleanness means? Do you realize that the Luzhkin cleanness is just the same as Sonia's cleanness, and for all we know is probably worse, more loathsome and more odious. For you see, my dear Dunya, you can still hope for a certain amount of comfort, whereas in Sonia's case it is simply a matter of life and death. It's an expensive, a very expensive sort of cleanness, dear Dunya. And what if you find afterwards that you can't bear it? Will you repent then? Think how much sorrow it will mean, how many curses and tears, hidden away from the whole world, for after all you are not Mrs. Svidrigaïlov. And what will happen to Mother then? For she's already worried now, she's already tormenting herself now. What will she feel like when she sees it all clearly? And what about me? And who asked you to think about me anyway? I don't want your sacrifice, Dunya. I don't want it, Mother. It shall not be so long as I live. It shall not be. I won't have it. He suddenly recollected himself and stopped. It shall not be? And what can you do to prevent it? Will you forbid it? What right have you to do that? What can you promise them in return to lay claim to such a right? To devote all your future, all your life to them after you have finished your course at the university and got yourself a job? We've heard that before, old chap. Those are only words. But what now? You simply have to do something now. You understand that? And what are you going to do now? And what are you doing now? You're robbing them. For all they get is borrowed money on account of their pension of 100 rubles, and on account of their wages from such gentry as the Svidrigaïlovs. How are you going to protect them from the Svidrigaïlovs, or from Vakrushin, you future millionaire, you Zeus who are arranging their lives for them? In another 10 years? Why, in another 10 years Mother would go blind from knitting shawls, and quite likely from weeping, too. She'd waste away from lack of food. And your sister? Just think what will happen to your sister in 10 years' time, or during those 10 years. Can you guess? So he kept tormenting himself with these questions, and he seemed even to derive some pleasure from it. Still, all these questions were not new, nor did they occur to him just at that moment. They were old, old questions that had long worried him. It was long since they had first begun to torment him, and at last they had rent his heart. Long, long ago, his present feeling of utter desolation and despair had arisen in him, and it accumulated and grew till in the last few months it had become concentrated and had come to a head, assuming the form of a fearful, wild, and fantastic question which exhausted his mind and heart, clamoring for an immediate solution. Now his mother's letter had burst upon him like a bombshell. It was clear that he ought not now to brood or to suffer passively, to waste his time in idle thoughts about how impossible it was to solve those questions, but that he had to do something, at once, and quickly too. He had made up his mind, at all costs, to do something. Anything, or renounce life altogether, he suddenly cried, beside himself. Humbly accept my fate such as it is, and forever give up every right to act, to live, and to love. Do you realize, sir, what it means when you have nowhere to go? He suddenly recalled the question Marmeladov had asked him the night before, for every man must have at least somewhere to go. Suddenly he gave a start. A thought flashed through his mind, a thought that had also occurred to him the day before, but he did not start because the thought had flashed through his mind. He knew, he felt, that it most certainly would cross his mind, and he was already waiting for it. And besides, it was not only yesterday that the thought had occurred to him, but the difference was that a month ago, and even yesterday, for that matter, it was only a dream. Whereas now it came to him no longer as a dream, but in a sort of new, terrifying, and completely unfamiliar guise, and he himself suddenly realized it. The blood rushed to his head and everything went black before his eyes. He looked round quickly. He was searching for something. He wanted to sit down and was looking for a seat. He was just then walking along the Horse Guards Boulevard. He could see the seat in the distance, about 100 yards ahead of him. He went to it as fast as he could, but on the way he became involved in a little incident, which for a few minutes absorbed all his attention. Trying to find a seat, he had noticed a woman who was also walking along the street a few paces in front of him, but at first he paid no more attention to her than to any of the objects moving about before him. Many a time, for instance, he happened to walk home without remembering the way he had come, and he was quite used to walking like that. But there was something so peculiar about the woman who was walking in front of him, something he could not help noticing at once, that gradually his attention became fixed on her. Reluctantly at first, as it were, resentfully, and then more and more intently. He suddenly felt a great desire to find out what was so peculiar about that woman. First, she was probably only a girl, a very young girl, in fact, and she was walking in the broiling sun without a hat, without a parasol, and without gloves, waving her arms about in a rather funny way. She wore a light silk dress, but one that had been put on in a very curious way. A dress that seemed scarcely to be fastened, and that was torn open behind at the top of the skirt, near the waist. A whole piece of material was torn off and hung loose. A little shawl was thrown over her bare neck, but seemed to lie crookedly sideways. And to crown it all, the girl was walking unsteadily, stumbling, and even staggering from side to side. This encounter at last aroused Raskolnikov's whole attention. He overtook the girl at the seat, but as soon as she reached it she collapsed on it, in the corner. She threw her head against the back of the seat and shut her eyes, apparently from utter exhaustion. But when Raskolnikov looked at her more closely, he realized at once that she was dead drunk. It was a strange and horrible sight. At first he even thought that he had made a mistake. He saw before him a very young girl of about 16, or possibly only 15, a fair-haired girl with a pretty little face, but all flushed and apparently a little swollen. The girl did not seem to be aware of what was happening to her. She put one leg across the other, displaying much more of it than was quite necessary, and to judge by all appearances she was hardly conscious of the fact that she was in the street. Raskolnikov did not sit down, but he did not want to go away either, but remained standing before her, wondering what he ought to do. That boulevard was never very crowded, but now, at 2 o'clock on such a hot day, there was scarcely anyone about. And yet, a little distance away, about 15 feet from them, at the very edge of the pavement, a gentleman was standing, and it was quite obvious that he would very much like to go up to the girl for some purpose of his own. He too must have caught sight of her in the distance, and was trying to overtake her. But Raskolnikov had interfered with his plans. He looked gloweringly at the young man, doing his best, however, to prevent Raskolnikov from noticing it, and waited impatiently for his turn, when the hateful tramp should have gone away. The whole thing was as plain as could be. The gentleman was smartly dressed, corpulent, thick-set man of about 30, the picture of health, with red lips and a small moustache. Raskolnikov became furious. He suddenly felt like insulting the fat dandy. He left the girl for a moment and went up to the gentleman. "Hey you, Svidrigaïlov! What do you want here?" he shouted, clenching his fists and laughing, his lips foaming with rage. "What do you mean, sir?" the gentleman asked sternly, frowning and looking at Raskolnikov with haughty astonishment. "Get going, that's what I mean. How dare you, you dirty ruffian!" And he raised his cane. Raskolnikov rushed at him with his fists, without stopping to consider that the thick-set gentleman was a match for 2 men like himself. But at that moment someone seized him firmly from behind. A policeman stood between them. "Now then, gentlemen, no fighting in a public thoroughfare, please," said the policeman, and turning sternly to Raskolnikov now that he had had time to examine his rags, he asked, "What do you want? Who are you?" Raskolnikov looked at him attentively. The policeman had the face of a gallant old soldier, with a huge grey moustache and an intelligent look. "You're just the man I want," he exclaimed, seizing the police constable by the arm. "I'm a former student. Raskolnikov's my name. I don't care," he turned to the smartly dressed gentleman, "if you know it too. As for you, officer," he addressed the policeman, "please come along, I want to show you something." And seizing the policeman's arm, he dragged him to the seat. "Look there, she's quite drunk. She's just been walking on the boulevard, goodness only knows who or what she is. But she doesn't look a professional. More likely she's been made drunk somewhere, and raped, for the first time, you understand, and turned out into the street. Look how her dress has been torn, and look how it has been put on. You see, she has been dressed, she did not dress herself, and by a pair of clumsy hands, a man's hands, that's quite obvious. And now look there, that fine gentleman with whom I was just about to have a fight, is unknown to me. I see him for the first time in my life, but he too caught sight of her in the street just now, and he saw that she was drunk and incapable, and now he badly wants to go up to her, and get to her before anyone else does, and as in her present condition she wouldn't be likely to offer any resistance, take her somewhere. I'm sure I'm right. Believe me, officer, I'm not mistaken. I saw him myself watching her and following her. Only unfortunately I was in his way, and he was just waiting for me to go away. Now he's walked off, standing still and pretending to light a cigarette. What can we do to save her from him? How are we to get her home to her parents? Please, think what it means." The policeman immediately saw what had happened. The intentions of the stout gentleman were of course obvious. But there was the girl to be considered. The police sergeant bent over to examine her more closely, and a look of real compassion came into his face. "Oh, what a pity," he said, shaking his head. "A mere child, too. She's been assaulted all right. Look here, miss," he began, calling to her. "Where do you live?" The girl opened her tired and bleary eyes, looking stupidly at the two men in front of her, and waved them away. "Listen," said Raskolnikov. "Here." He fumbled in his pocket and produced 20 kopecks. He had them, after all. "Take this, please. Get a cab and tell the driver to take her home. All we have to do is find out where she lives." Miss," the policeman began again, taking the money. "I'll get you a cab and take you home myself. Where shall I take you, eh? Where do you live?" "Go away, leave me alone," the girl muttered, and again waved them away. "Oh, what a shame, miss, what a shame. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a young lady like you." He shook his head again, deprecatingly, pityingly, indignantly. "I don't know what to do, sir." He turned to Raskolnikov again, and at the same time cast a quick, penetrating glance at him, examining him from head to foot. Raskolnikov must have appeared very odd to him, too, dressed in such rags and giving away money. "When did you first notice her, sir?" he asked. "Was it far from here?" "I tell you, she was walking in front of me, swaying from side to side, just here in the street. The moment she reached the seat she collapsed on it. Oh, the disgraceful things that happen all over the place nowadays, sir. Lord, a young innocent creature like that, and drunk already. Yes, sir, she must have been assaulted all right. Look how her dress has been torn. What terrible goings-on, sir. A young lady of a good family by the look of her. Her parents must be poor, I suppose. There are hundreds like her about, sir. Looks like a decently brought-up girl, a well-bred young lady." And again he bent over. Quite possibly he had daughters of the same age himself, well-bred young ladies with the manners of well-brought-up girls, and all the assumed airs and graces of young women of fashion. "The main thing is," Raskolnikov pleaded, "not to let her fall into the clutches of that scoundrel. I'm sure he intends to rape her. It's easy to see what he wants. Look at the swine. He isn't even going away." Raskolnikov spoke in a loud voice, pointing to the stout gentleman. The latter heard him, and was about to fly into a temper again, but he changed his mind and confined himself to a contemptuous glance. He then slowly walked off another 10 paces and stopped again. "Well, sir, I can make sure he doesn't get her," said the police sergeant thoughtfully. "If only she'd tell us where to take her, otherwise— Miss, I say, miss." He bent over her again. The girl suddenly opened her eyes wide, looked attentively at them, seemed to become aware suddenly of something, got up from the seat, and walked back in the direction from which she had come. "What cheek! Won't leave a girl alone," she said, waving them away once more. She walked away quickly, but still swaying violently as before. The smartly dressed gentleman followed her, but on the other side of the boulevard, without taking his eyes off her. "Don't worry, sir, I won't let him have her," said the policeman with the big moustache in a firm voice, and went after them. "What terrible goings-on," he repeated aloud, sighing. At that moment something seemed to sting Raskolnikov. In an instant he became quite a different man. "I say, hey there!" he shouted after the policeman with the moustache. The policeman turned round. "Leave them alone. It's not your business. Let them be. Let him," he pointed at the smartly dressed gentleman, "have his fun. What do you care?" The policeman stared at him uncomprehendingly. Raskolnikov laughed. "Poor fellow," said the old soldier with a wave of mingled pity and contempt, and walked off after the dandy and the girl, probably taking Raskolnikov for a madman or something worse. "Walked off with my 20 kopecks," Raskolnikov muttered bitterly when left alone. "Well, let him. I suppose he'll get something from the other fellow too, and let him go away with the girl. Well, that will be the end of it. And what the hell made me interfere? Who am I to help her? Have I any right to help anyone? Let them devour each other alive for all I care. What business is it of mine? And what right had I to give away the 20 kopecks? They weren't mine, were they?" In spite of this strange outburst, he felt very depressed. He sat down on the empty seat. His thoughts wandered aimlessly, and in any case he found it difficult to think of anything just then. He wished he could forget everything, fall into a dead stupor, and then wake up and start everything afresh. "Poor girl," he said, glancing at the empty corner of the seat. She'll recover, have a good cry, then her mother will find out. At first she'll give her a beating, then she'll flog her hard, ignominiously, till it hurts, and then she'll most likely turn her out of doors. And even if she does not turn her out, some Darya Franzovna is sure to know everything out, and the poor girl will soon be walking the streets looking for customers. Then almost at once the hospital. This invariably happens with those who live with their mothers and have a bit of fun on the sly. And then, well, the hospital again, drinks, pubs, and again the hospital. And in about 2 or 3 years a human wreck. And anyway, all she can count on is 18 or 19 years of life. Haven't I seen hundreds of such girls? And what brought them to it? Why, just that sort of thing. Anyway, to hell with it. Let them. That's how it should be, they say. It's essential, they say, that such a percentage should every year go that way, to the devil. It's essential so that the others should be kept fresh and healthy. And it's not to be interfered with. A percentage. What fine words they use, to be sure. So soothing, scientific. All you have to do is say percentage, and all your worries are over. Now, of course, if you use some other word, well, then perhaps it would make you feel a little uncomfortable. And what if Dunya should somehow or other find herself among that percentage? If not that, then another. And where am I going to? He thought suddenly. Curious. I came out for something. Came out as soon as I had read the letter. Oh yes, I was going to Vasilyevsky Island to call on Razumikin. That's it. I remember now. But what for? Why did the idea of calling on Razumikin occur to me just now? That's extraordinary. He was surprised at himself. Razumikin was one of his former fellow students. It was a remarkable fact that at the university Raskolnikov had scarcely had any friends. He kept away from everyone, did not visit anyone. He felt very ill at ease when anyone came to visit him. He took no part in general meetings of the students, or conversations, or games, or anything, in fact. He worked hard, without sparing himself, and he was respected for it, but no one liked him. He was very poor, and somehow superciliously proud and uncommunicative. It was as though he were keeping something to himself. Some of his fellow students had the impression that he looked on them as though they were children, from above, as though he were miles ahead of them in general development, knowledge, and convictions, and as though their own convictions and interests were beneath him. With Razumikin he had, for some reason, become friends. But they were not really friends, though Raskolnikov was more communicative and frank with him. However, it was hardly possible to be on any but friendly terms with Razumikin, who was an extraordinarily cheerful and communicative young fellow, good-natured to the point of simplicity. His simplicity, however, was not without its depths and its sense of dignity. His best friends were aware of this, and everyone was fond of him. He was far from stupid, though he was sometimes a little simple. He was of a striking appearance, tall, lean, always badly shaven, dark-haired. Occasionally he ran wild, and he had the reputation of being a man of unusual physical strength. One night, when out on the spree with the other students, he felled a 6-foot policeman with one blow. He could drink like a fish, but he could also abstain from drinking altogether. Sometimes he went a bit too far in the pranks he played, but there were times when he did not play any pranks at all. Razumikin was also remarkable for never taking any of his failures to heart, and never being unduly cast down by any circumstances, however straitened. He could make himself at home even on a roof. He could go without food for days and put up with the most arctic conditions. He was very poor and managed to keep himself without any outside assistance whatever, earning the money he needed by any kind of work. He knew all sorts of ways of making money, of course. One winter he did not heat his room at all, declaring that he slept much better in a cold room. At present he, too, had been obliged to leave the university, but not for long. He was doing his utmost to improve his circumstances, so as to be able to resume his studies. Raskolnikov had not seen him for the last 4 months, and Razumikin did not even know where he lived. One day, about 2 months ago, they had run across each other in the street, but Raskolnikov had turned away, and even crossed to the other side, not wishing to be seen. Razumikin did see him, but he passed him by, as he did not want to annoy a friend. As a matter of fact, I did think some time ago of asking Razumikin for some work. Wanted him to get me a few lessons or something, Raskolnikov reflected. But how can he help me now? Suppose he does get me some lessons. Suppose he even shares his last penny with me, if he has one himself, so that I could buy myself a pair of boots and mend my clothes and be able to give lessons. What then? What shall I do with my few coppers afterward? Is that what I want? Really, what an absurd idea to go to Razumikin. The question why he was now going to see Razumikin worried him more than he realized. He was anxiously trying to find some ominous meaning in this. It would seem quite ordinary action. Good Lord, did I really think of putting everything right by turning to Razumikin for help? Did I really find a solution of all my difficulties in Razumikin? He asked himself in surprise. He went on thinking, rubbing his forehead, and strangely enough, after thinking for a long time, a most extraordinary idea came into his head, suddenly, as though by sheer accident, as though by itself. Well, yes, to Razumikin, he said suddenly very calmly, as though he had finally made up his mind. I shall call on Razumikin, of course, but not now. I shall call on him another time, on the day after I've done it, after that has been settled, and when everything is different. And suddenly he realized what he was saying. After that? He cried, jumping up from the seat. But is that to be? Will it really happen? He left the seat and walked away almost at a run. He was about to turn back home, but the idea of going home suddenly appalled him. It was there in that awful cubbyhole of his, in that terrible cupboard. All that had been taking shape in his head for the past month, and he went on walking aimlessly. His nervous tremor had grown feverish. He even felt shivery. On such a hot day he was feeling cold. As though with a great effort, he began, almost unconsciously, by some kind of inner compulsion, to examine very carefully everything he had happened to come across on his way, as though looking desperately for something to distract his attention. But he found it difficult to concentrate on anything, and he lapsed into thought almost every minute. When he again raised his head with a start to look around, he immediately forgot what he had just been thinking about, and even where he had been a minute ago. In this way, he walked right across the whole of Vasilyevsky Island, came out onto the little Neva, crossed the bridge, and turned toward the islands. The green vegetation and the fresh air at first pleased his tired eyes, used to the dust of the city, to the lime and mortar and the huge houses that enclosed and confined him on all sides. The air was fresh and sweet here, no evil smells, no pubs. But soon even these new and pleasant sensations grew irritating and painful. Sometimes he would stop before some country cottage, smothered in greenery, look through the fence, see in the distance, on the balconies and terraces, smartly dressed women, and children running about in the garden. It was the flowers, though, that attracted his attention the most. He stopped to look at them longer than at anything else. He also came across fine carriages, and men and women on horseback. He followed them with curious eyes, and forgot all about them before they had vanished out of sight. Once he stopped and counted his money. It seemed that he still had 30 kopecks. 20 to the policeman, 3 to Nastasia for the letter. That means that I must have given 47 or 50 to the Marmeladovs yesterday, he thought, for some reason counting it all up. But he soon forgot even why he had taken the money out of his pocket. He remembered it when he passed some restaurant, a kind of an inn, and felt that he was hungry. He went into the inn, drank a glass of vodka, and ate a bit of pasty. He finished eating it, when again on the road. He had not drunk vodka for a long time, and it had an immediate effect on him, though he had only drunk a wineglassful. His legs grew suddenly heavy, and he began to feel a strong inclination to sleep. He turned back home, but on coming as far as Petrovsky Island, he stopped, feeling completely exhausted, left the road, and making his way into some bushes, lay down on the grass and fell asleep at once. When people are in a bad state of health, their dreams are often remarkable for their extraordinary distinctness and vividness, as well as for their great verisimilitude. The whole picture is sometimes utterly monstrous, but everything about it, and the whole process of its presentation, are so amazingly plausible, and all its details are so delicately etched and unexpected, and yet so artistically consistent with everything else in it, that the man who is dreaming it could never have invented it in real life, were he as great an artist as Pushkin or Turgenev. Such dreams, morbid dreams, are always remembered a long time afterward, and produce a strong impression on a man's disordered and overexcited organism. Raskolnikov dreamed a terrible dream. He dreamed of the time when he was a child, and when they had still lived in their little provincial town. He was a boy of 7. It was a holiday, late in the afternoon, and he was out for a walk in the country with his father. It was a dull and sultry day, and the place was exactly as he remembered it. Even in his memory it was not as distinct as he saw it now in his dream. The little town stood on an open, flat plain, and they could see it clearly spread out before their eyes. There was not a willow anywhere near to obstruct their view. Only somewhere far away could they catch a glimpse of a dark wood outlined faintly on the rim of the sky. A few yards from the last kitchen garden in the town stood a big pub, which had always made a most unpleasant impression on him, and made him feel afraid every time he passed it with his father as they went for their walk. There were always such crowds of people there, people who were always yelling, laughing, cursing, and singing so hideously and hoarsely. And very often they had regular fights with one another. And around the pub they always met such horribly drunken people, that every time they came across them he clung close to his father, trembling all over. Not far from the pub was a road, a rough country road, which was always dusty, and the dust on it was always so very black. It stretched windingly away in the distance, and about 300 yards on further it turned to the right, skirting the town cemetery. In the middle of the cemetery was a stone church with a green cupola, to which he used to go twice a year to morning mass with his father and mother, when a service was held in memory of his grandmother who had long been dead and whom he had never seen. For the service they always used to take with them a special funeral dish, on a white plate and wrapped in a white napkin. And the funeral dish was of sweetened rice and raisins stuck into it in the shape of a cross. He loved that church with its ancient icons, mostly without settings, and the old priest with the shaking head. Beside the grave of his grandmother, which was covered with a gravestone, was the little grave of his 6-month-old brother, whom he had also never known, and could not remember. He had been told, however, that he had a little brother, and every time he visited the cemetery he used to cross himself over the grave religiously and reverently, and bow down and kiss it. And now he dreamt that his father and he were walking along the road to the cemetery, and were passing the pub, and he was holding his father's hand and gazing fearfully at the pub. A particular circumstance attracted his attention. This time there seemed to be some sort of an outing there, a crowd of artisans' wives, in their best finery, peasant women and their husbands, and all sorts of riff-raff. They were drunk and they were singing songs. Near the front steps of the pub stood a cart, but it was a very strange cart. It was one of those large carts usually drawn by large dray horses, and used for the transportation of goods and casks of vodka. He always liked watching those huge dray horses, with their long manes and thick legs, walking leisurely with measured steps, and drawing a whole mountain behind them, but without the slightest strain, as though they found it so much easier going with carts than without carts. But now, curiously enough, some peasant's small, lean, greyish-brown mare was harnessed to one of these huge carts. The sort of poor old nag which he had seen so often found it very hard to draw quite an ordinary cart with wood or hay piled on top of it, especially when the cart was stuck in the mud or in a rut, and every time that happened the peasant flogged her so brutally, sometimes even across the eyes and muzzle, and he felt so sorry for the poor old horse, that he almost burst into tears, and his mother always used to take him away from the window. But now, in front of the pub, pandemonium suddenly broke loose. A crowd of blind drunk big peasants in red and blue shirts, with their coats thrown over their shoulders, came out of the pub, yelling and singing and strumming their balalaikas. "Come on, get on my cart," yelled one of them, quite a young peasant with a terribly thick neck and a very red, beefy face. "I'll drive you all home, get in." But almost immediately there was an outburst of loud laughter and shouts. "Look at that old nag of his, drive us all home, will he? Have you lost your senses, Mikolka? What made you put such an old weed in a big cart like that? That mare is 20 if she is a day, lads." "Come on, I'll drive you all home," Mikolka shouted again, jumping into the cart, before everyone else, picking up the reins and standing, drawn up to his full height in front. "Matvey has taken the bay," he shouted from the cart, "and this here old nag of mine, lads, is just breaking my heart. I should have cut her throat long ago. Doesn't earn her keep, she doesn't. Come on, I say, get in, all of you. I'll make her jump. I'll make her go a-galloping all the way. You'll see, she'll go a-galloping all the way." And he took the whip in his hands, preparing himself gleefully to whip the little grey-brown mare. "Come along, let's get in," laughing voices were raised in the crowd. "Do you hear? He'll make her go a-galloping all the way. I bet you she's never gone a-galloping for 10 years or more. She'll be skipping along. Don't spare her, lads. Take your whips, all of you. Ready? Aye, serves her right. Give her a good flogging." They all got into Mikolka's cart, laughing and joking. 6 men clambered into the cart, and there was still room for more. They took a fat, red-cheeked peasant woman with them. She wore a red cotton dress, the traditional head-dress of a married woman, ornamented with beads, and fur-lined boots, and she was cracking nuts and just smiling to herself. In the crowd, too, people were laughing, and indeed, how could they help laughing? The mare was all skin and bones, and there she was supposed to drag such a heavy load at a gallop. 2 young lads in the cart at once took a whip each, and got ready to help Mikolka. There was a shout, "Gee up!" and the poor mare started pulling away with all her might, but far from galloping, could scarcely manage to move the cart one step at a time, working away helplessly with her legs, snorting and cowering under the blows of the 3 whips, which were belaboring her mercilessly. The laughter in the cart and in the crowd was redoubled, but Mikolka was beginning to lose his temper, and in his fury he showered blow after blow on the helpless mare, as though he really thought she could gallop. "Let me lend you a hand, lads," a young fellow in the crowd cried, his fingers itching to have a go at the old mare. "Come on, get in, all of you," Mikolka shouted. "She'll take you all. I'll flog the life out of her." And he went on flogging and flogging. In his blind fury he hardly knew what to hit her with. "Daddy, Daddy," he cried to his father. "Daddy, look what they're doing. Daddy, they're beating the poor little horse." Come along, son," said his father. "They're drunk, having fun, the fools. Come on, don't look." And he tried to take him away, but he tore himself out of his father's hands, and hardly realizing what he was doing, ran to the old horse. But the poor old mare was already in a very bad state. She was gasping for breath, standing still, pulling at the cart again, and almost collapsing in the road. "Flog her to death!" shouted Mikolka. "I don't mind. I'm going to flog her to death myself." "Why, you devil!" shouted an old man in the crowd. "Ain't you got the fear of God in you?" "Who ever saw a poor old nag like that pulling such a big load?" added another. "You'll flog her to death!" shouted a third. "Mind your own business. She's my property, isn't she? I'll damn well do what I like with her. Come on, there's plenty of room. Come on, all of you. I'm going to make her gallop if it's the last thing I do." A loud peal of laughter suddenly drowned everything. Unable to stand the rain of blows from the whips any longer, the poor beast started kicking helplessly. Even the old man could not help smiling, and to be sure, such a bag of bones, and there she was kicking. The 2 lads in the crowd also armed themselves with whips and ran to the mare, intending to flog her from each side. They ran up to take their positions. "Whip her across the muzzle," shouted Mikolka. "Across the eyes! Whip her across the eyes!" "Let's have a song, lads," someone in the cart shouted, and everyone in the cart took up the cry. They started singing a boisterous song. A tambourine tinkled, and there was shrill whistling during the refrains. The young peasant woman went on cracking nuts and smiling to herself. He ran beside the old mare. He ran in front of her. He saw her being whipped across the eyes, across the very eyes. He was crying. His heart heaved. Tears rolled down his cheeks. One of the men who were flogging the horse grazed his face with the whip, but he felt nothing. Wringing his hands and screaming, he rushed up to the old man with the gray beard, who was shaking his head and condemning it all. A woman took him by the hand and tried to lead him away, but he freed himself and ran back to the poor old horse, which seemed to be at the last gasp, but started kicking once more. "Oh, to hell with you!" shouted Mikolka furiously, and throwing down his whip, he bent down and dragged out a long, thick shaft from the bottom of the cart. Taking hold of it by one end with both hands, he swung it with an effort over the gray-brown mare. "He'll strike her dead!" they shouted all round. "He'll kill her!" "My property!" shouted Mikolka, and let fall the shaft with all his might. There was the sound of a heavy thud. "Flog her! Flog her! Why have you stopped?" shouts were heard in the crowd. And Mikolka swung the shaft another time, and another terrific blow fell across the back of the unhappy mare. She subsided on her haunches, but presently was on her feet again, pulling with all her remaining strength, first on one side and then on another, trying to move the cart. But they were belaboring her from every side with 6 whips, and the shaft was raised again and fell for the 3rd and then the 4th time, slowly, with terrific force. Mikolka was furious because he had not been able to kill her with one blow. "Alive and kicking," they shouted on all sides. "Bet she'll fall any minute now, lads," shouted a sportsman in the crowd. "She's about finished." "Why don't you strike her with an axe? Dispatch her at once," a third one shouted. "Oh, damn her! Make way!" Mikolka yelled furiously, and throwing down the shaft he once more bent down in the cart and pulled out an iron bar. "Mind," he shouted, swinging it with all his might over the poor old horse. The bar came down with a crash. The old mare swayed, subsided, and was about to give another pull at the cart, when the bar at once descended on her back with terrific force, and she collapsed on the ground, as though her 4 legs had given way from under her all at once. "Finish her off!" Mikolka shouted, jumping down from the cart, blind with rage. A few young men, also red-faced and drunk, seized whatever they could lay their hands on, whips, sticks, the shaft, and ran to the dying mare. Mikolka stood on one side, and started raining blows across her back with the iron bar, without bothering to see where the blows were falling. The mare stretched out her head, heaved a deep sigh, and died. "Settled her," they shouted in the crowd. "Why didn't she gallop?" "My property!" shouted Mikolka, iron bar in hand and with bloodshot eyes. He stood there as though he were sorry he had nothing more to flog. "Aye, ain't you got the fear of God in you at all?" many voices were already shouting in the crowd. But by now the poor little boy was beside himself. He pushed his way through the crowd to the gray-brown mare, put his arms around her dead, blood-stained muzzle and kissed her on the eyes, on the lips. Then suddenly jumped to his feet and rushed in a rage at Mikolka with his little fists. But just then his father, who had been running after him, caught hold of him at last and carried him out of the crowd. "Come along, son, come along," he said to him. "Let's go home." "Daddy, why? Why did they kill the poor little horse?" he whimpered. But suddenly his breath failed him, and the words came in shrieks from his panting breast. "They're drunk," said his father, "playing the fool. It's not our business. Come along." He put his arms round his father, but his chest tightened, and he felt choked. He tried to draw a breath to cry out, and woke up. Raskolnikov woke up in a cold sweat, his hair wet with perspiration, gasping for breath, and he raised himself in terror. "Thank God it was only a dream," he said, sitting down under the tree and drawing deep breaths. "But what's the matter with me? These are not the symptoms of a fever, are they? What a horrible dream!" Every bone in his body seemed to ache. His soul was in confusion and darkness. He put his elbows on his knees and propped his head on his hands. "Good God!" he cried. "Is it possible that I will really take a hatchet, hit her on the head with it, crack her skull, slither about in the warm, sticky blood, break the lock, steal and shake with fear, hide myself all covered in blood and with the hatchet? Good God, is it possible?" He was shaking like a leaf as he said this. "But what am I thinking of?" he went on, sitting up again, and as though in great astonishment. "I knew very well that I wouldn't be able to carry it out, so why have I been tormenting myself all this time? Even yesterday, yes, even yesterday when I went to that rehearsal, even yesterday I knew very well that I shouldn't be able to go through with it. So what am I worrying about now? Why have I been in doubt about it till now? When I was coming down the stairs yesterday, I said to myself that the whole thing was foul and disgusting, why the thought of it actually made me feel sick and filled me with horror. No, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. Even if there were no mistake whatever in all my calculations, even if anything I had decided during the past months were as clear as daylight and as true as arithmetic. Good Lord, don't I know I shall never be able to make up my mind to do it? No, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. So why am I still—" He got up, looked round him in surprise, as though wondering how he had got there, and walked off in the direction of Tutchkov Bridge. He was pale, his eyes were burning, he was utterly exhausted, but he felt suddenly that he could breathe more freely. He felt that he had already cast off the terrible burden that had so long been weighing on him, and all of a sudden he felt greatly relieved and at peace with himself. "O Lord," he prayed, "show me the way and I shall give up this damnable dream of mine." As he crossed the bridge, he gazed calmly and quietly at the Neva, and at the bright red glow of the sunset. In spite of his weakness, he did not seem to feel tired. It was as though the abscess which had been coming to a head in his heart for a whole month had suddenly burst. He was free. He was free. He was now free from all those obsessions, magic spells, delusions, witchcraft. Afterwards, when he recalled those days, and all that happened to him then, minute by minute, point by point, bit by bit, he could not help being secretly struck by one circumstance, which, though scarcely unusual, always seemed to him afterward as a sort of predestined turning point of his fate. He could not, that is, understand or explain to himself why he, worn out and exhausted as he was, did not go home by the shortest and direct way, but by way of the Haymarket Square, where there was no need for him to go. The detour was not particularly long, but it was so obviously unnecessary. It is true that he used to return home hundreds of times without remembering the streets he had walked through. But why, he always asked himself, why had such an important, such a decisive, and at the same time such an entirely accidental meeting in the Haymarket, where he had no business to be at all, occurred just at that hour, and even that minute of his life, and just when he happened to be in that particular mood, and just under those circumstances when that meeting was able to exert the most decisive and conclusive influence on his destiny. It was as though it had all happened on purpose, as though the meeting had been specially arranged for him. It was about 9 o'clock when he crossed the Haymarket. All the tradesmen, hawkers, stall-holders, and big and small shopkeepers were shutting up shop, taking down and clearing away their merchandise, and like their customers going home. All sorts of tradespeople and rag-and-bone men gathered in large crowds at the entrances of eating-houses on the lower floors, and in the dirty and stinking courtyards of the houses, and most of all near the pubs. Raskolnikov was particularly fond of these places, as well as of all the alleyways in the vicinity, whenever he went out for a stroll in the streets. Here his rags attracted no one's supercilious attention, and he could go about dressed as he liked without scandalizing anybody. At the corner of Horse Lane, a street trader and his wife had set up 2 stalls with haberdashery wares, reels of cotton, ribbons, cotton handkerchiefs, and so on. They too were getting ready to go home, but they had stayed behind talking to a woman they knew who had just come up. This woman was Lizaveta Ivanovna, or simply, as she was known to everyone, Lizaveta, the younger sister of Alyona Ivanovna, the old woman money-lender, and widow of a government clerk, whom Raskolnikov had been to see the day before to pawn his watch and carry out his rehearsal. He had known all about Lizaveta Ivanovna for a long time, and she too knew him slightly. She was a tall, ungainly, shy and meek woman of about 35, almost an idiot, who was held in complete subjection by her sister, working for her day and night, bullied and even beaten by her. She was standing hesitatingly with a bundle in front of the tradesman and his wife, and listening very attentively to them. The two seemed to be speaking to her very heatedly about something. When Raskolnikov suddenly caught sight of her, he was overcome by a strange feeling, resembling intense astonishment, though there was nothing astonishing about that meeting. "You'd better decide for yourself, Lizaveta," the tradesman was saying in a loud voice. "Come round tomorrow at 7. They'll be there too." "Tomorrow?" Lizaveta repeated in a drawn-out, wondering voice, as though she could not make up her mind. "I can see, my dear, that it's Alyona Ivanovna you're afraid of," the stall-holder's wife, a quick-witted woman, began talking very fast. "My goodness, you're just like a baby, so you are. And she isn't your sister really, but your half-sister, and look how she's got you under her thumb." "This time you needn't say a word about it to Alyona Ivanovna," her husband interrupted. "Take my advice and come round to us without asking. You'll make a good profit out of this, and I'm sure your sister will understand when she hears about it afterwards." "So you think I ought to come?" "At 7 tomorrow. They'll send someone too, and you'll be able to decide for yourself. And I'll have a cup of tea waiting for you, dear," added his wife. "All right, I'll come," said Lizaveta, still as if not quite sure, and she began walking slowly away. Raskolnikov too went away immediately, and heard nothing more. He had walked past quietly and unnoticed, trying not to miss a word. His astonishment was gradually converted into a feeling of horror, as though a cold shiver had run down his spine. He had suddenly and quite unexpectedly learned, that the next day, at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, Lizaveta, the old woman's sister, and the only person who lived with her, would not be at home, and that consequently, at exactly 7 o'clock, the old woman would be entirely alone in the house. He was only a few yards from his home. He entered his room like a man sentenced to death. He thought of nothing, and indeed he was quite incapable of thinking, but he suddenly felt, with all his being, that he no longer possessed any freedom of reasoning or of will, and that everything was suddenly and irrevocably settled. Of course, even if he had had to wait for years for a favorable opportunity, he could not, having once made up his mind to carry out his plan, have even then been entirely sure of a more favorable one than that which had been so suddenly presented itself to him now. At any rate, he would have found it very hard indeed to discover for certain, on the day before, with such exactness, and with the least possible risk, and without any dangerous inquiries or investigations, that next day, at such and such an hour, such and such a woman, on whose life an attempt was to be made, would be entirely alone at home. Raskolnikov happened to find out afterwards why the stall-holder and his wife had invited Lizaveta to come and see them. It was a most ordinary sort of business, and there was nothing at all remarkable about it. A family who had come to live in Petersburg and fallen on evil days were selling off their things, dresses, etc., all of it women's clothing. As their things would have fetched very little in the market, they were looking for a dealer, and Lizaveta was engaged in that kind of business. She bought and sold second-hand clothes, and had a large connection because she was very honest and sold at the lowest prices. and whatever offer she made had to be accepted. Besides, she did not generally talk a great deal, and was, as already mentioned, a very meek and timid woman. But during the last month or so Raskolnikov had become superstitious. Traces of his superstitiousness remained in him long after, and indeed it was almost ineradicable. And always afterward he was inclined to see in all this something strange and mysterious, the presence, as it were, of some kind of influence and coincidences. The previous winter a student he knew, called Prokhorov, had happened in conversation to give him the address of the old woman pawnbroker, in case he should ever want to pawn anything. For a long time he did not go to her because he had private lessons and managed to get along somehow. 6 weeks ago he had remembered the address. He had 2 articles that were good enough to pawn: his father's old silver watch and a little gold ring with 3 red stones his sister had given him as a keepsake before he left for Petersburg. He decided to take the ring. Having found the old woman, he at once, though he knew nothing about her, conceived a violent aversion for her. He took 2 little notes from her, and on his way home went into a little restaurant where he ordered tea, sat down, and fell into thought. A strange idea was hatching in his brain, like a chicken and egg, an idea that he was beginning to find more and more fascinating. Almost next to him at another table sat a student whom he did not know, and had never seen with an army officer. They had had a game of billiards and were drinking tea. Suddenly Raskolnikov heard the student speak to the officer about Alyona Ivanovna, the old woman moneylender, and give him her address. This seemed rather strange to Raskolnikov, who had just come from there, and they were also talking about her. It was mere chance, of course, but all the same, here he was, unable to shake off a rather unusual impression, and at that very moment someone seemed to be presenting him with all the facts. The student all of a sudden began telling his friend all sorts of details about that same Alyona Ivanovna. "She's an excellent woman," he said. "You can always get money from her. Rich as a Jew. Could easily let you have 5,000, but she isn't very particular about taking a pledge for 1 ruble. Lots of our fellows have been to her place, only she's a frightful old she-devil." And he began telling his friend what a bad-tempered and unreliable woman she was, and how if you were only a day late in redeeming your pledge, you were never likely to see it again. She offered you, as a rule, a quarter of what your article was worth, and charged you 5 or even 7% a month on it, and so on. The student went on giving all sorts of details about the old woman moneylender, mentioning incidentally the fact that she had a sister, Elizaveta, whom she treated like a small child, bullying and even beating her continually, though she herself was a frail little creature, while Elizaveta was at least 6 foot tall. "She too is a bit of a phenomenon," the student exclaimed, and burst out laughing. They began talking about Lizaveta. The student spoke about her with a sort of keen relish, laughing all the time, while the army officer listened with great interest, and asked him to send Lizaveta to him to mend his linen. Raskolnikov did not miss a word, and learned everything about the 2 women. Lizaveta was the younger one. She was the old woman's half-sister. They had different mothers. She was 35. She worked day and night for her sister, cooked and did all her washing, as well as some dressmaking and even charring, and gave all she earned to the old woman. She did not dare to accept any order or job without the old woman's permission. Moreover, the old woman had already made her will, which was well known to Lizaveta, who had not been left anything in it except the old woman's movables, chairs, etc. All the money was left to the monastery in Novgorod province, that prayers might be said for the old woman's soul on every anniversary of her death. Lizaveta belonged to the artisan class, unlike her sister, who had married into the civil service class. She was unmarried, terribly ungainly, quite extraordinarily tall, with large splayed feet. She always wore a pair of old battered goatskin shoes, and kept herself meticulously clean. What so surprised the student, however, and made him laugh, was that Lizaveta always seemed to be pregnant. "But didn't you say she was ugly?" observed the officer. "Yes, she has a very dark complexion, and she looks like a soldier dressed up as a woman. But she isn't at all ugly. She has a very kind face and eyes. Yes, very much so. And the proof of it is that many men seem to find her attractive. She is such a quiet creature, gentle, timid, and acquiescent. She acquiesces in everything. And she also has a very sweet smile." "It seems you find her attractive too," laughed the officer. "Well, I do. I like her because she's such a strange creature. And I tell you what, I'd gladly murder that damned old woman and rob her of all she has. And that, I assure you, without the slightest compunction, the student added warmly. The officer laughed again, but Raskolnikov gave a start. How odd it was. Now look here, let me ask you a serious question, the student said, growing more and more excited. I was joking, of course. But look at it this way. On the one hand, we have a stupid, senseless, worthless, wicked, and decrepit old hag, who is of no use to anybody and who actually does harm to everybody, a creature who does not know herself what she is living for, and who will be dead soon anyway. You see what I mean, don't you? I do, said the officer, watching his excited friend attentively. All right, now listen, please. On the other hand, we have a large number of young and promising people who are going to rack and ruin without anyone lifting a finger to help them, and there are thousands of them all over the place. Now 100 or even 1,000 of them could be set on the road to success and helped at the very start of their careers on that old woman's money, which is to go to a monastery. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives could be saved, dozens of families could be rescued from a life of poverty, from decay and ruin, from vice and hospitals for venereal diseases. And all with her money. Kill her, take her money, and with it help devote yourself to the service of humanity and the good of all. Well, don't you think that one little crime could be expiated and wiped out by thousands of good deeds? For one life you will save thousands of lives from corruption and decay. One death in exchange for 100 lives. Why, it's a simple sum of arithmetic. And when you come to think of it, what does the life of a sickly, wicked old hag amount to when weighed in the scales of the general good of mankind? It amounts to no more than the life of a louse or a black beetle, if that, for the old hag is really harmful. For one thing, she is ruining the life of another human being. She is really wicked, I tell you. Only the other day she bit Lizaveta's finger from sheer spite, and it was only saved from amputation by a miracle. Well, I quite agree she does not deserve to live, observed the officer. But don't forget, it's human nature we're dealing with here. My dear fellow, but even human nature can be improved and set on the right path, for otherwise we should all drown in a sea of prejudices. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a single great man. People talk of duty or conscience. Well, I have nothing against duty or conscience, but are you quite sure we know what those words mean? Wait, let me ask you another question. Now listen. No, you wait, and let me ask you a question. Listen. Well, here you go on, talking and making speeches at me, but tell me, would you kill the old woman yourself? Of course not. I was merely discussing the question from the point of view of justice. Personally, I'd have nothing to do with it. Well, in my opinion, if you are not ready to do it yourself, then it's not a question of justice at all. Come on, let's have another game. Raskolnikov was greatly agitated. Of course, this was the usual sort of thing he had often heard young people discussing, though perhaps in a different form and on a different subject. But why had he happened to hear just that kind of discussion, and listened to the expression of just such ideas, at the very moment when exactly the same ideas were just beginning to stir in his own mind? And why had he happened to overhear that conversation just at the moment when he himself had brought the germ of the same idea from the old woman? This coincidence always struck him as very strange. This idle talk at a restaurant was to exert a very great influence on him as the whole thing grew and developed. It was as though there had really been something preordained here, a kind of sign. On his return from the Haymarket, he flung himself on the sofa, and sat for a whole hour without moving. Meanwhile it got dark. He had no candle, and indeed it never entered his head to light one. He never could remember whether he had been thinking about anything at that time. At length he felt feverish again. He began to shiver, and it was only then that he realized that there was no reason why he should not lie down on the sofa. Soon he sank into a heavy, leaden sleep, which seemed to press him down as with some huge weight. He slept quite unusually long and without dreaming. Nastasia, who came into his room at 10 o'clock the next morning, had difficulty in waking him. She brought him tea and bread. The tea was again stewed, and again in Nastasia's teapot. "Never seen such a sleeper in all my life," she cried indignantly. "Always asleep." He raised himself with an effort. His head ached. He got up, took a turn in his little room, and dropped down on the sofa again. "Not going to sleep again?" Nastasia cried. "Are you ill or something?" He made no reply. "Don't you want your tea?" "Later," he said with an effort, closing his eyes again and turning to the wall. Nastasia stood over him for a minute or two. "I suppose he must be ill," she said, turned and went out of the room. At 2 o'clock she came in again with a plate of soup. He was lying as before. The tea had not been touched. Nastasia could not help feeling hurt, and she began shaking him angrily. "Why don't you get up?" she shouted, looking at him with disgust. He raised himself and sat up. but he did not say anything to her, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Are you ill or what?" asked Nastasia, and got no reply. "Why don't you go out for a walk?" she said after a pause. "Get a breath of fresh air. Do you a world of good, it will. Are you going to have something to eat or not?" "Later," he said weakly. "You can go now." And he dismissed her with a wave of the hand. She stood there a little longer, looked at him with compassion, and went out. A few minutes later he raised his eyes and gazed for a long time at the tea and soup. Then he took the bread, picked up his spoon, and began to eat. He ate a little without appetite, just 3 or 4 spoonfuls of soup, in a mechanical sort of way. Having finished his dinner, he again stretched out on the sofa, but he could not sleep. He lay motionless with his face buried in the pillow. He kept daydreaming, and his daydreams were all so strange. Mostly he imagined himself to be in Africa, in Egypt, in some sort of oasis. The caravan was resting, the camels were lying down peacefully, palms were growing in a circle all round. They were all having their meal, but he was drinking water all the time, straight from a little stream that flowed babbling close by. And it was so cool, and the water so wonderfully blue and cold, running over the stones of many colors, and over such clean sand, which here and there glittered like gold. Suddenly he distinctly heard a clock strike. He gave a start, came to, raised his head, glanced at the window, and realizing how late it was, leapt to his feet, wide awake, as though someone had pulled him violently off the sofa. He tiptoed to the door, opened it carefully, and began to listen for any noise on the stairs. His heart pounded. But all was quiet on the stairs, as if everyone in the house was asleep. It seemed strange and crazy to him, that he could have slept so soundly, and had so far done nothing, had prepared nothing, and for all he knew the clock might have struck 6, and his sleep and stupor gave way suddenly to an unusually feverish and confused sort of agitation. He tried hard to think of everything, and to forget nothing, and his heart went on beating fast, thumping so heavily that he could hardly breathe. First he had to make a sling and sew it onto the lining of his overcoat. That wouldn't take a minute. He rummaged under his pillow, and found beneath the heap of dirty linen stuffed away under it, a dirty and torn old shirt. He tore a long strip off it, about 2 inches wide and 16 inches long. He folded this strip in 2, took off his wide, strong summer overcoat, made of some thick cotton material, the only overcoat he had, and began sewing the 2 ends of the strip under the left armpit inside the sleeve. His hands shook as he sewed it on, but he finished the job, and so well too that when he put his coat on again, nothing could be seen outside. The needle and thread he had prepared long ago, and kept in his table drawer in a piece of paper. As for the sling, it was entirely his own clever invention. The sling was intended for the hatchet. He could not possibly have walked through the streets with a hatchet in his hands, and if he had concealed it under his coat, he still would have had to support it with his hand, which again would have attracted attention. But now, with that sling, he had only to slip the blade of the hatchet through it, and it would hang safely under his arm, inside the coat all the way. And by putting his hand in the left pocket of his overcoat, he could support the top of the handle too, to prevent it from swinging. And his coat was very wide, a regular sack in fact. It could not be seen from outside that he was holding something with his hand inside his pocket. The idea of the sling had also come to him a fortnight ago. That done, he thrust his hand into a small crack in the wall behind his Turkish divan, rummaged for a minute or so in the left-hand corner, and pulled out the pledge he had prepared long before and had hidden there. This pledge, as a matter of fact, was not a pledge at all, but simply a smoothly planed, flat piece of wood about the size and thickness of a silver cigarette case. This piece of wood he had found by accident during one of his walks in a courtyard, where there was some sort of a workshop in a shed. Afterwards he had added to the wood a thin, smooth piece of iron, probably a broken-off piece of some metal article, which he had also found in the street at the same time. Putting the 2 pieces together, the iron one was a little smaller than the wooden one. Together he tied them firmly, crosswise, with a thread, then he wrapped them carefully and neatly in a piece of clean white paper, and tied it up, also crosswise, with thin tape, doing up the knot in such a way that it would take some time to undo it. He did that because he was anxious to divert the attention of the old woman a little, so as to get enough time for himself, while she was trying to undo the knot. The iron strip was added for the sake of weight, so that the old woman should not guess at once that the article was made of wood. All this he had for the time being kept under his sofa. No sooner did he get out his pledge than he heard someone in the courtyard shout, "It has struck 6 long ago." Long ago! Good God! He rushed to the door, listened for a moment, grabbed his hat, and started going down his 13 steps, taking the utmost care to be as quiet as a mouse. The most important thing had still to be done. He had to get the hatchet from the kitchen. That it had to be done with a hatchet he had decided long ago. He had a clasp knife, but he could not rely on a knife, and still less on his own strength, and that was why he had finally decided to use a hatchet. Let us incidentally observe one peculiarity in connection with all of these final decisions he had taken in this matter. They all possessed one strange characteristic. The more final they became, the more absurd and more horrible they at once appeared in his eyes. In spite of this agonizing inner struggle of his, he could never, during all these weeks, for a single moment, believe in the practicability of his plans. But even if it had at any time happened that he had planned and settled everything to the last detail, and no doubt of any kind had remained in his mind, he would, it seems, have given it all up as something that was too absurd, monstrous, and impossible. But there was still a mass of things to arrange and points to settle. As for getting the hatchet, that trifling matter did not worry him in the least, for there was nothing easier than that. The fact was that Nastasia was very often out, particularly in the evenings. She'd either run off to some neighbors or to a shop, always leaving the kitchen door wide open. That was the only reason for the constant rows between her and her mistress, so that all he had to do when the time came was to go quietly into the kitchen, get the hatchet, and an hour later, when everything was over, go in and put it back in its old place. But of course, the thing was not as simple as all that. Supposing he came back an hour later and found that Nastasia had in the meantime returned to her kitchen. In that case, he would, of course, have to go back to his room and wait until she went out again. But what if she should meanwhile have discovered the loss of the hatchet, and started looking for it and raising a clamor? That would certainly give rise to suspicion, or at any rate might serve as a cause for suspicion. But those were all trifles, which he had never even considered seriously. And besides, he had hardly any time to bother his head about them. It was the main problem that occupied his mind all the time, and he postponed the consideration of trifles until he himself was sure of everything. And to be sure of everything seemed to him absolutely impossible. At least, so he thought. He could never, for instance, imagine that the time would come when he would stop thinking, get up, and just go there. Even his recent rehearsal, that is to say, his visit to the old woman with the idea of having a good look around, he had merely tried to carry out. He had gone there not because he was really in earnest, but just because he had said to himself, "Let's go and have a look, why go on dreaming about it?" And he could not keep it up, but had run away, furious with himself. And yet it would seem that his whole analysis, so far as the moral solution of the question was concerned, had already been completed. His casuistry was as sharp as a razor, and he could no longer find any conscious objections to his plans in his mind. But at heart, he never really took himself seriously, and he went on, slavishly and stubbornly, fumbling for some valid objection in all directions, as though someone were compelling and pushing him to do it. This last day, however, coming so unexpectedly and deciding everything all at once, had almost an automatic influence upon him. It was as though someone had taken him by the hand and drawn him after himself, blindly, irresistibly, with supernatural force, and without any objections on his part, as though he had been caught in the cog of a wheel by the hem of his coat and was being drawn into it. At first, it was a long time ago, though, he had been greatly interested in the question why almost every crime was so easily solved, and the clues left behind by almost every criminal so easily discovered. Gradually, he had arrived at all sorts of interesting conclusions, and in his opinion the main reason for it lay not so much in the physical impossibility of concealing a crime as in the criminal himself. The criminal himself, at least almost every criminal, is subject at the moment of the crime to a kind of breakdown of his reasoning faculties and of his willpower, which are replaced by an amazingly childish carelessness just at the moment when he is most in need of caution and reason. According to his conviction, therefore, it would seem that this eclipse of reason and loss of willpower attacked a man like some disease, developed gradually, and reached its climax a short time before the crime was actually committed. It continued the same way at the moment of the crime and for a short time afterwards, according to each individual. Then it passed off like any other disease. But the question whether the disease was the cause of the crime, or whether the crime itself, owing to some peculiarity of its nature, was always accompanied by something that is very much like a disease, he did not, as of yet, feel able to answer. Having reached these conclusions, he decided that so far as he was concerned, there could be no question of his suffering from the symptoms of this disease, and that there was, consequently, no danger of his reasoning or will-power being in any way affected during the carrying out of his plan, simply because what he intended to do was not a crime. We leave out the whole process of reasoning which had brought him to that conclusion. We have, as it was, run ahead too much. Let us merely add that the actual material difficulties of the whole business occupied only a secondary place in his mind. If only I succeed in keeping my will and my reasoning faculties unimpaired, then all the difficulties will be overcome at the moment when I get thoroughly familiar with all the details of the business. But the business showed no signs of getting started. He continued to be least of all impressed by his final conclusions, and when the hour struck, everything happened not at all as he had anticipated, but somehow by sheer accident, almost unexpectedly. One trifling circumstance baffled him even before he had gone downstairs. On reaching his landlady's kitchen, the door of which was, as always, wide open, he looked into it cautiously, as if to subject it to a preliminary examination. Was not his landlady herself there in the absence of Nastasia, and if not, was the door to her own room properly closed, so that she too might not by any chance pop her head through it when he came in for the hatchet? But what was his amazement when he suddenly saw that this time Nastasia was not only in the kitchen, but was actually doing something there, taking the washing out of a basket and hanging it on the line. Seeing him, she stopped hanging out the washing, turned to him, and watched him all the while as he walked past the door. He looked away, and walked past as if he had not noticed anything. But the whole thing had fallen through. He had no hatchet. He was dumbfounded. And what on earth made me think, he reflected as he walked through the gates, what on earth made me think that she wouldn't be in at that moment? Why was I so dead sure about it? He was crushed, even somehow humiliated. He felt like laughing at himself with rage. He was boiling over with blind, brutish anger. He stopped under the gates to think things over. He did not feel like walking along the street and pretending to go for a stroll, and he felt even less like going back to his room. "And what a chance I have missed for good!" he muttered, lingering aimlessly in the gateway just opposite the caretaker's dark lodge, the door of which was also open. Suddenly he started violently. His eyes caught a glint of steel in the caretaker's lodge, only a few yards away from him. It came from under a bench to the right. He looked round cautiously. There was no one about. He tiptoed to the caretaker's lodge, went down 2 steps, and called the caretaker in a faint voice. "I thought so. He isn't in. Must be somewhere near, though. Probably in the courtyard, because the door's wide open." He went straight for the hatchet. It was a hatchet, and pulled it out from under the bench where it lay between 2 logs. He attached it to his sling, there and then, without leaving the room, thrust his hands into his pockets, and went out. No one saw him. "If it isn't your brain working, my lad, it's the devil himself," he thought with a strange grin. That piece of luck put new heart into him. He walked along the street calmly and soberly, without hurry, so as not to arouse suspicion. He scarcely glanced at the passers-by, and even did his best not to look at their faces and to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. Then he remembered his hat. "Good God, and I had the money the day before yesterday, and I didn't think of getting a cap," he swore loudly. Glancing accidentally out of the corner of his eye into a shop, he saw by the clock on the wall that it was already 10 minutes past 7. He had to hurry and make a detour, to go round the house and approach from the other side. Whenever he happened to go over it all in his mind before, he sometimes could not help thinking that he would be in a dreadful stew. But not only was he not in a dreadful stew now, but was not in the least afraid. Indeed, at that moment his mind was preoccupied with all sorts of things that had nothing to do with his present business, though not for long. Walking past Yusupov Park, he became entirely absorbed in the question of improving its amenities by high-playing fountains, and he could not help thinking that they would improve the air in all the squares marvelously. Gradually he came to the conclusion that if the summer gardens were extended to Mars Square and even joined on to Mikhailovsky Palace Gardens, it would be a most wonderful improvement for the town. Then another thought suddenly struck him. Why was it, he wondered, that in all the large cities people seemed inclined to congregate, not by any means out of sheer necessity, just in the parts where there were neither gardens nor fountains, but dirt, bad smells, and every kind of abomination? He then remembered his own walks in the Haymarket, and for a moment he seemed to wake up. What silly nonsense, he thought. No, much better not to think of anything at all. It is like that, I suppose, that the thoughts of those who are led to execution cling to everything they see on the way. It flashed through his mind, but it only flashed through like lightning. He himself dismissed that thought as quickly as possible. But he was already nearing his destination. There was the house. And there were the gates. Somewhere a clock chimed once. Good Lord, it isn't 1/2 past already, is it? It can't be. The clock must be fast. Luckily, everything went off all right at the gates. Not only that, but as though on purpose, a huge cart of hay drove in front of him through the gates just at that time, screening him from sight while he was passing under the gateway. And the moment the cart drove into the yard, he slipped through it to the right. On the other side of the cart, he could hear several people shouting and arguing with one another. But he had not been noticed by anybody, and he met no one either. Many windows, which looked out on that huge square yard, were open at the time. But he did not raise his head. He had not the strength to do so. The staircase to the old woman's flat was near, only a few yards from the gates to the right. He was already on the stairs. Taking breath and pressing his hand against his thumping heart, he immediately felt for the hatchet and once more put it straight. Then he began to mount the stairs very quietly and cautiously, stopping every moment to listen for any suspicious noise. But the stairs, too, were completely deserted at the time. All the doors were closed, and he met no one. On the first floor, it was true, the front door of one empty flat was wide open, and painters were at work there, but they, too, did not notice him. He stopped, thought a little, and went on. It would of course been much better if they hadn't been there, but there are 2 more floors over them. At last he was on the 4th floor. There was the door of the old woman's flat, and there was the other flat across the landing, the one that was empty. According to every sign, the flat on the 3rd floor under the old woman's flat was also empty. The visiting card nailed to the door had been taken off, which meant that the people there had moved out. He was out of breath. For a moment the question flashed through his mind, "Shall I clear out?" But he did not answer, and began listening at the old woman's door. Dead silence. Then he once more carefully listened for any noise on the stairs below. He listened a long time, carefully. Then he looked round for the last time, stopped for a minute to put himself to rights and pull himself together, and once again adjusted the hatchet in its sling. "Hope I'm not looking too pale," he thought to himself, "not too agitated. She's very suspicious. Had I better wait a little longer till my heart stops thumping?" But his heart would not stop thumping. On the contrary, it seemed as though on purpose to thump more and more violently. He could hold out no longer, put his hand out slowly to the bell, and rang. Half a minute later he rang again, more loudly. There was no answer. To go on ringing would be unwise, and besides, he was hardly important enough a person for that. The old woman was of course at home, but she was suspicious and alone. He was not entirely unfamiliar with her habits, and once again he put his ear close to the door. Whether his senses were so keyed up, which was extremely unlikely, or whether he really did hear something, but he seemed suddenly to become aware of a faint noise, as though someone had touched the door handle with a hand very cautiously, and as though there was a rustle of a skirt at the door. Someone was standing very quietly close to the very lock of the door, as he was doing so on the outside, listening carefully, lying low inside, and it seemed, also with an ear pressed to the door. He deliberately stirred and muttered something loudly so as not to create the impression that he was hiding. Then he rang a 3rd time, but quietly, soberly, and with no sign of impatience. Recalling it later, that moment was indelibly imprinted on his mind, clearly, vividly. He could not understand where he had got so much cunning from, particularly as his reason seemed to stop functioning altogether from time to time. And as he had almost lost the feel of his body, a moment later he heard someone unbolting the door. The door, as before, opened outward about an inch, and again 2 sharp and mistrustful eyes stared at him out of the dark. Here Raskolnikov lost his head and nearly made a bad mistake. Afraid that the old woman would be frightened to be alone with him, and hardly hoping that his appearance would reassure her, he took hold of the door and pulled it towards himself, so to make sure that she would not take it into her head to lock herself in again. Seeing this, she did not pull the door back, but she did not let go the door handle either, with the result that he almost dragged her out together with the door on to the landing. Realizing, however, that she was standing across the threshold and barred his way, he advanced straight on her. She jumped back in panic, tried to say something to him, but was apparently unable to utter a word, and just stared at him with wide-open eyes. "Good evening, Alyona Ivanovna," he began, speaking as casually as possible, but his voice would not obey him, faltered and shook. I've brought you something, but perhaps we'd better go in, to the light." And leaving her, he went straight into the room without waiting to be asked in. The old woman rushed in after him. Her tongue was loosened now. "Goodness gracious, what do you want? Who are you? What is it you want?" "Why, Alyona Ivanovna, don't you remember me? I'm Raskolnikov, an old acquaintance of yours. Here, I've brought you the pledge I promised the other day." And he held out the pledge to her. The old woman glanced at the pledge, but immediately stared again into the eyes of the uninvited visitor. She looked at him fixedly, mistrustfully, angrily. A minute passed. He even thought he could see something like a sneer in her eyes, as though she had already guessed everything. He felt that he was losing his grip, that he was frightened, so frightened, indeed, that if she had looked at him like that, without uttering a word for another 30 seconds, he would have run away from her. "But why do you look at me as though you don't know me?" he said suddenly, also angrily. "You can have it if you want it, but if not, I'll go somewhere else. I've no time to waste." He had never intended to say this, but the words somehow came out by themselves. The old woman recovered herself, and her visitor's tone evidently reassured her. "But why, sir, be in such a rush? What is it?" she asked, looking at the pledge. "The silver cigarette case. Don't you remember me telling you about it last time?" She held out her hand. "But why are you so pale? Your hands are trembling. You haven't come out straight after a hot bath, sir, have you?" "Fever," he replied abruptly. "You can't help looking pale if you've had nothing to eat," he added, scarcely able to utter the words. He felt his strength was failing him again. But the answer seemed plausible enough. The old woman took the pledge. "What is it?" she asked, casting another penetrating glance at Raskolnikov, and feeling the weight of the pledge in her hand. "Oh, it's a cigarette case, a silver one. Have a look." "Doesn't feel like a silver one, somehow. Tied it up, didn't you?" Trying to untie the ribbon and turning to the light, all her windows were closed in spite of the stifling heat, she left him entirely alone for a couple of seconds, standing with her back to him. He unbuttoned his coat, disengaged the hatchet from the sling, without, however, taking it out altogether, but just supporting it with his right hand under the coat. His hands were terribly weak. He could himself feel how they were growing more and more numb and lifeless every moment. He was afraid he would let go the hatchet and drop it. Suddenly he felt his head was beginning to spin. "What have you tied it up for like this?" the old woman cried in a vexed voice, making a movement as though about to turn round to him. There was not a moment to lose. He took out the hatchet, raised it with both his hands, hardly feeling what he was doing, and almost with no effort, almost mechanically, struck her on the head with the back of it. There seemed to be no strength at all left in him as he aimed the blow, but the moment he brought the hatchet down, all his strength returned to him. As always, the old woman had nothing on her head. Her thin, fair, graying hair was as usual smothered in oil, twisted into a rat's tail plait, and gathered up under what was left of a broken horn comb, which stuck out at the nape of her neck. Being a small woman, the blow fell straight across the crown of her head. She uttered a cry, though a very faint one, and suddenly dropped to the floor, though still managing to raise her hands to her head. In one hand she still held the pledge. It was then that he struck her again with all his strength, and then again, every time with the back of the hatchet and across the crown of the head. Blood gushed out from an overturned tumbler. Gushed out as though from an overturned tumbler, and she fell straight on her back. He drew away to let her fall, and then, at once, bent over her face. She was dead. Her eyes were popping out of her head as though ready to jump out of their sockets, and her forehead and whole face were terribly drawn and contorted. He put the hatchet down on the floor near the dead woman, and at once put his hands into her pocket, taking care not to be covered with the flowing blood, into the very same right pocket from which she had taken out the keys last time. He was now in full possession of his senses. He did not feel dizzy, nor were there any sudden gaps in his consciousness, but his hands were still shaking. He recalled later that he was particularly careful and circumspect, doing his best not to get any blood on his hands or clothes. He took out the keys at once. They were all, as before, in one bunch, on one steel ring. He immediately ran into the bedroom with them. It was a very small room, with a huge icon case. Against the other wall stood a big bed, spotlessly clean and with a silk patchwork quilt coverlet. Against the third wall stood a chest of drawers. A curious thing. The moment he began fitting the keys into the drawers, the moment he heard their jingling, a sort of spasm passed over him. Again, he suddenly felt like leaving everything and going away. But that lasted only an instant. It was too late to go. He even grinned sardonically at himself, when all of a sudden another alarming thought occurred to him. He suddenly fancied that the old woman was still alive, and that she might come too. Leaving the keys in the chest of drawers, he rushed back to the body, seized the hatchet, and raised it once more over the old woman. but he did not let it fall. There was no doubt that she was dead. Bending down and examining her more closely, he saw clearly that her skull was fractured and even slightly battered in on one side. He was about to touch it with his finger, but withdrew his hand quickly. He could see it well enough, anyway. Meanwhile, a whole pool of blood had collected on the floor. Suddenly, he noticed a ribbon round her neck. He pulled at it, but it was strong and did not break. It was, besides, soaked with blood. He tried to pull the thing that was attached to it out of her bosom, but something prevented it from coming out. It stuck there. In his impatience, he again swung the hatchet over her head to cut through the ribbon from above on her body, but he dared not to do it. And after spending 2 minutes over it and covering the hatchet in his hands in blood, he succeeded in cutting through the ribbon without touching the body with the hatchet, and took it off. It was a purse. There were 2 crosses on the ribbon, one of cypress wood and another of copper, and in addition a little enameled icon, and with them a small greasy chamois leather purse, with a steel rim and a little ring. This purse was full to bursting. Raskolnikov shoved it into his pocket without bothering to see what was in it, threw the crosses on the old woman's body, and taking the hatchet with him this time, rushed back to the bedroom. He was in a terrible hurry, picked up the keys and began trying them. But for some reason all his efforts were of no avail. The keys would not fit in any of the locks. Not that his hands were shaking as badly as all that, but he kept making mistakes. For instance, he would see that a key did not fit, but he kept trying it. Suddenly, he remembered the big key with the notches in the bit, which was hanging there with the other small keys, and he realized that it could not possibly belong to the chest of drawers. The same idea had occurred to him last time, but to some trunk or box, and that it was there that everything had most likely been hidden away. He left the chest of drawers and crawled under the bed. And he was not mistaken. There was a biggish box under the bed, about a yard in length, with a rounded lid covered with red morocco and studded with steel nails. The notched key fitted it perfectly, and immediately unlocked it. On top, under a white sheet, lay a hareskin coat with red trimmings. Under it was a silk dress, then a shawl, and there seemed to be nothing in it but clothes. First of all, he began to wipe his blood-stained hands on the red trimmings. It's red, and blood doesn't show so much on red, he thought to himself, but suddenly he came to his senses with a start. Good Lord, am I going off my head? He thought in a panic. But no sooner did he shake the clothes out than a gold watch fell out from underneath the fur coat. He started turning everything inside out, and sure enough, among the clothes were all sorts of gold articles, all pledges no doubt, some of them still waiting to be redeemed and others unredeemed, bracelets, chains, earrings, pins, and so on. Some of them were in cases, others simply wrapped in bits of newspaper, but accurately and carefully, each in double sheets and tied round with tape. Without wasting any time, he began to stuff them into the pockets of his trousers and his coat, without stopping to pick and choose, and without opening the packets and cases. But he did not have time to collect many of them. Suddenly, he heard the sound of footsteps in the room where the old woman was. He stopped and was still as death. But everything was quiet. He must have imagined it all. But all of a sudden, he distinctly heard a faint cry, or as though someone had uttered a faint, abrupt moan and stopped. For the next minute or two, there was again dead silence. He was squatting on his haunches by the box and waited, hardly daring to breathe. But suddenly he jumped to his feet, snatched up the hatchet, and rushed out of the bedroom. In the middle of the room stood Lizaveta, with a big bundle in her arms, looking petrified at the dead body of her sister. She was as white as a sheet and did not seem to have the strength to cry out. As she saw him running out of the bedroom, she trembled all over, her whole body shaking like a leaf, and her face twitching convulsively. She raised her hand a little, opened her mouth, but did not utter a cry. She began walking backward, backing away from him slowly towards the corner of the room, without taking her eyes off him, but still without uttering a sound, as though she had no breath left in her body to cry out. He rushed at her with the hatchet. Her lips twisted pitifully, like those of little children who are beginning to be afraid of something, and without taking their eyes off the object of their fright are about to scream. And so simple, crushed, and cowed was this unhappy Lizaveta, that she did not even lift her hands to protect her face, though that was the most natural and inevitable gesture at that moment. For the hatchet was now raised straight over her face. All she did was to lift her free hand a little, at some distance from her face, and extend it slowly toward the hatchet, as though pushing it away. The blow fell straight across her skull. She was hit with the blade of the hatchet, which split the top of her forehead open, penetrating almost to the crown of her head. She just collapsed in a heap on the floor. Raskolnikov almost lost his head. He picked up her bundle, threw it down again, and rushed out into the passage. He was more and more seized with panic, especially after this second, quite unexpected murder. He wanted to run away from there as quickly as possible, and if at that moment he had been in a condition to think and see everything in a clearer light, if only he had been able to realize the difficulties of his present situation, to see how absurd, hideous, and desperate it was, and if in addition he could have grasped how many more difficulties there were still to be overcome, and how many murders even he might still have to commit before he could get away from there and make his way home, he would most probably have left everything and would have gone to give himself up, and not because of any fear for himself, but in sheer horror and disgust at what he had done. It was this feeling of disgust that seemed especially to grow stronger and stronger every minute. Nothing in the world would have induced him now to go back to the box and even to the room. But gradually he seemed to fall into a kind of brown study, or even reverie. There were moments when he seemed to forget everything, or at least to forget the main thing and to start worrying about something that did not matter. However, glancing into the kitchen and noticing a pail half full of water on a bench, he had enough sense to wash his hands and the hatchet. His hands were sticky with blood. He put the hatchet with the blade into the water, then grabbed a piece of soap that lay on a broken saucer on the window sill, and began washing his hands in the pail. Having washed off the blood, he took out the hatchet, scrubbed the iron clean, and went on for some time, for 3 minutes or so, scrubbing the blood stains off the handle, even trying to get the blood off with the soap. Then he wiped it on the washing, which was drying on a line stretched across the kitchen. After which he spent a long time examining the hatchet carefully at the window. There was no trace of blood left on it. The wood alone was still damp. He carefully replaced the hatchet in the sling under his coat. Then, as much as the bad light in the kitchen allowed, he examined his coat, trousers, and boots. From the outside, at first glance, there seemed to be nothing wrong with them. Only on his boots were there a few bloodstains. He wetted a rag and wiped his boots. He realized, however, that his examination was too perfunctory, and that there might be something that would attract attention which had escaped his notice. He stopped wonderingly in the middle of the room. A horrible somber thought was stirring in his mind, the thought that he was acting like a madman, and that at that moment he was not in a position to think clearly or to do anything to protect himself, and that generally he most probably should not be doing what he was doing now. "Good God! I must get out of here! I must run!" he muttered, rushing out into the passage. But in the passage a horror awaited him, such as he had not ever experienced before. He stood there, unable to believe his own eyes. The front door, leading from the passage to the stairs, the same door before which he had so recently stood ringing the bell and through which he had come in, stood open, at least 5 inches open, neither locked nor even latched all that time. The old woman had not shut the door after her, perhaps as a precaution. But, good Lord, he had seen Lizaveta afterwards, and how had it not occurred to him that she must have come in from somewhere? She couldn't have come in through a wall. He rushed to the door and bolted it. But what am I doing? I must get out of here. I must get out. He unbolted the door, opened it, and listened. He stood listening a long time. Somewhere, far below, probably at the gates, 2 men were shouting, loudly and shrilly, abusing one another. What was it all about? He waited patiently. At last the noise stopped as though cut by a knife. They had gone. He was just going out when a door opened noisily on the floor below, and someone started running down the stairs humming a tune. What an infernal din they're all raising, he thought. Again he closed the door and waited for the noise to stop. At last everything was quiet, not a sound. He was going to walk down the stairs when he heard more footsteps. These footsteps were still a long way off, at the very bottom of the stairs, but he remembered distinctly afterward that the moment he had heard the sound of the footsteps, he for some reason suspected that someone was coming up to the 4th floor, to the old woman. Why? Was there anything peculiar, anything significant about the sound of those footsteps? They were heavy, steady, unhurried. Now he had already passed the 1st floor, and now he was going up to the 2nd. The footsteps were getting more and more distinct. He could already hear the heavy breathing of the man who was coming up the stairs. Now he was going up to the 3rd floor. He was coming here. And all of a sudden he felt as though he were turned to stone, as though it were all happening in a dream, where you are chased by a murderer who is getting nearer and nearer, but you are unable to stir. You seem to be rooted to the ground, unable to even lift your arms. And at length, when the visitor was already coming up to the 4th floor, he suddenly gave a violent start, and was just in time to slip quickly and with quite amazing agility from the landing back into the flat, and shut the door behind him. Then he took the bolt and shot it into place very quickly and without making a sound. His instinct helped him. Having done all this, he held his breath and crouched close to the door. They were now opposite each other, with only the door between them, just as he and the old woman had been a short while ago, when only the door separated them, and he was listening intently. The visitor panted heavily a few times. Must be a big fat man, thought Raskolnikov, clasping the hatchet in his hand. The whole thing was like a nightmare. The visitor seized the bell and rang loudly. The moment the bell rang, he heard its tinny sound. Raskolnikov had a queer feeling that there was a movement in the room. For a few seconds he even listened quite seriously for any sound in there. The unknown man rang again, waited a little, and suddenly in his impatience began rattling the handle of the door violently. Raskolnikov gazed in horror at the jumping bolt, and petrified with fear, waited for it to jump out at any minute. This was indeed very probable, the man rattled the handle so hard. For a moment he wondered whether he ought not to put his hand on the bolt, but he might have guessed what was happening. His head seemed to start spinning again. Good Lord, I'm going to collapse in a faint on the floor, it flashed through his mind. But the man began to speak, and he at once recovered himself. What's the matter with them? Are they asleep, or has someone strangled them? Damn 'em! He roared suddenly, as though from the bottom of a cask. Hi there, Alyana Ivanovna, you old witch! And you too, Lizaveta Ivanovna, my beauty! Open up, damn you! Are they asleep, or what? And beside himself with rage, he pulled at the bell again with all his might about a dozen times. There could be no doubt that he was on familiar terms with the two women, and a man of authority besides. At that moment there came the sound of quick, hurried steps from somewhere very near on the stairs. Raskolnikov did not even hear them approaching. "Isn't anyone in?" the newcomer shouted in a loud and jovial voice, addressing the first visitor, who went on still pulling the bell. "Hullo, Koch." From his voice, I should say that he is very young, Raskolnikov thought suddenly. "I'm sure I don't know. I've very nearly smashed the lock," replied Koch. "But may I ask you, sir, how you happen to know me? Why, don't you remember? I beat you 3 times running at billiards at Gambrunis the day before yesterday." "Oh! So they're not in, are they? That's funny. A damn nuisance, though. Where could the old woman have gone to? I've got a business appointment with her." "So have I, sir." "Well, there's nothing we can do about it, is there? We'd better go back. Oh, blast! And I was hoping to get some money from her," the young man cried. "Of course we shall have to go back. Only why did she make the appointment with me? It was the old hag herself who told me to come out of my way, too. And where the hell could she have run off to, I wonder? She's always at home, the old witch. All the year round. Got aches and pains in her legs, and now all of a sudden she goes for a walk. Hadn't we better ask the caretaker? What about? Why, where she's gone to, and when she'll be back. What the hell is the use of asking? She never goes out anywhere." And at once he tugged at the handle of the door. "Damn it, it's no use. Let's go." "Wait," the young man cried suddenly. "Look, do you notice how the door moves in and out as you pull it?" "Well?" "Don't you see? That means that it isn't locked, but bolted or latched. Can't you hear the bolt rattling?" "Well?" "Why, that proves that one of them at least is home. If they had both gone out, they would have locked the door from the outside and not bolted it from the inside. But now, can't you hear the bolt rattling? And to bolt the door from the inside, they must be at home, isn't that so? I think it's pretty clear that they are at home. But don't open the door." "Good Lord, yes!" cried the astonished Koch. "What the devil are they doing there?" And he started rattling the door furiously. "Wait," the young man cried again. "Stop pulling. There's something funny here. You've rung and you've pulled and they don't open, which can only mean that either they've both fainted or what? I tell you what, let's go and fetch the caretaker. Let him wake them up." "Right-o." They moved away from the door. "Wait a minute. I think you'd better stay here while I run down and fetch the caretaker." "Why should I stay here?" "Well, you never can tell, can you? Perhaps you're right. You see, as a future public prosecutor, I can't help feeling that there's something very, very queer here," the young man cried warmly and ran down the stairs. Koch remained at the door. He rang the bell again very gently, making it ring once. Then, very quietly, as though thinking it over and inspecting it, he began moving the door handle, pulling it and letting it go, in order to convince himself once more that the door was only bolted. Then, puffing and blowing, he bent down and began looking at the keyhole. But as the key was inside the lock, he could see nothing. Raskolnikov stood there, clasping the hatchet in his hand. He was in a kind of delirium. He was even ready to attack them the moment they came in. When they were knocking and talking to one another, the thought occurred to him suddenly a few times to put an end to it, an end to it all by shouting at them from behind the door. And at times he felt like starting cursing and taunting them while they were still unable to open the door. Oh, if only one could get it over quickly, it flashed through his mind. What the hell is he doing there? Koch muttered. Time passed, 1 minute, another. Nobody was coming back. Koch was becoming restless. What the hell? He cried suddenly, impatiently, and leaving his post, he too went downstairs, thumping with his boots on the stairs. The sound of his footsteps died away. Good heavens, what am I to do now? Raskolnikov unbolted the door and opened it a little. Not a sound. Suddenly, without giving it another thought, he went out, shut the door as firmly as possible behind him, and went downstairs. He had gone down 3 flights of stairs when all of a sudden he heard a loud noise on the floor below. What was he to do? There was no place he could hide. He was just going to have to run back to the old woman's flat. Hi there, damn you, stop! Someone rushed out of a flat on the floor below with a yell and did not so much run as fall down the stairs, bawling at the top of his voice. Dmitri! 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 Blast! The shout ended in a scream. The last sounds already came from the yard. Everything was quiet again. But at that very moment several men, talking rapidly and in loud voices, began mounting the stairs noisily. There were 3 or 4 of them. He heard the loud ringing voice of the young man. It's them. In sheer despair he went straight to meet them, come what might. If they stopped him, all was lost. If they let him pass, all was lost too. For they were sure to remember him. They were already on the point of meeting on the stairs. Only 1 flight of stairs remained between them. And suddenly he was saved. A few steps below him, on the right, was an empty flat, the door of which was wide open, the same flat on the 2nd floor in which the painters had been at work, and now, as though by design, they had gone out. It was they who had probably run out with such a shout a minute ago. The floors of the rooms had just been painted. In one room stood a little wooden tub, an earthenware pot with a paint and a brush. He darted quickly through the open door and hid himself behind the wall. And he was just in the nick of time. They were already on the landing. Then they turned toward the stairs, passing by the open door, and went up to the 4th floor, talking in loud voices. He waited till they were safely out of the way, went out on tiptoe, and ran downstairs. There was no one on the stairs, nor in the gateway. He went down quickly through the gates and turned to the left into the street. He knew perfectly well, that at that moment they were already in the flat, that they had been very surprised to find it open when a few moments earlier it had been shut, that they were already looking at the bodies, and that in less than a minute they would realize that the murderer had just been there and had had time to hide himself somewhere, slip by them, and escape. They might even guess that he had been hiding in the empty flat while they were going up the stairs, and in spite of this he dared not quicken his step, though there only remained about 100 yards to the next turning. Shouldn't I slip through a gate and wait on some staircase till the hue and cry has died down? No, that would be asking for trouble. But oughtn't I to get rid of the hatchet somewhere? Should I take a cab? I'm in a frightful mess. At last he reached the lane. He turned down it, more dead than alive. Here he was, almost safe, and he was fully aware of it. He would arouse less suspicion, and besides, there were crowds of people coming and going, and he was lost among them like a grain of sand on the seashore. But all that terrible anxiety had weakened him to such an extreme that he could scarcely walk. He was dripping with perspiration, his neck was all wet. "Properly sozzled, aren't you?" someone shouted to him when he came out on the Yekaterinski Canal. He was now hardly aware of what he was doing himself. The farther he went, the less did he seem able to remember what was happening to him. He did remember, however, that on reaching the Yekaterinski Canal, he became suddenly frightened because there were so few people about, as that would make him more conspicuous, and he was about to turn back into the lane, though feeling that he might collapse at any minute, he made a detour and came home from quite a different direction. His thoughts were in a terrible muddle, and when he passed through the gates of his house, at least, it was only on the stairs that he remembered the hatchet. And yet there was still one more important job he had to do. He had to replace the hatchet without attracting attention. He was, of course, no longer able to appreciate the fact that perhaps it would have been better not to replace the hatchet, but to get rid of it later by leaving it in the courtyard of some house. But everything went off without the slightest mishap. The door of the caretaker's lodge was closed but not locked, which seemed to indicate that the caretaker was at home. But he had lost the ability to think things out clearly to such an extent that he went straight to the caretaker's lodge and opened it. If the caretaker had asked him what he wanted, he would most probably have simply handed him the hatchet. But again the caretaker was not in, and he had plenty of time to put the hatchet back in its old place under the bench, and even to cover it up as before with a log. He did not meet anyone, not a soul, on the stairs afterwards, and he reached his room without being seen. The door of his landlady's flat was closed. On entering his room, he threw himself down on the sofa just as he was. He did not fall asleep, but lay there in a sort of stupor. If anyone had come into the room, he would have at once leapt screaming to his feet. Scraps and fragments of thoughts swarmed in his head, but he could not fix his mind on a single one of them. He could not concentrate on a single one of them, even for a short time, much as he tried to.